I first saw her on the train. It was a Tuesday, just after 6 p.m., when the subway was at its loudest and most miserable. The air smelled like sweat and forgotten lunches, and everyone sat or stood with their heads down, scrolling or staring at nothing, pretending the other humans didn't exist. I was squeezed between a guy with headphones blasting tinny drum beats and a woman reading a self-help book with a cover so fluorescent it looked radioactive. I almost didn't notice her. She sat at the far end of the train, in the last row of seats, where the fluorescent light flickered like it couldn't make up its mind. Her hair was long and dark, falling over her shoulders in waves, and she wore a white dress that looked like it belonged in another century. She wasn't reading or scrolling, or pretending not to exist. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. No one else seemed to notice her. Her expression was blank, but there was something unnervingly still about her, like she was waiting for something to happen. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, pretending to scroll through my phone, but she didn't move. Not once. When the train pulled into the next station and the doors opened with that awful hydraulic wheeze, I looked away for just a second. When I glanced back, she was gone. I told myself I was tired. That's what the city does to you. It frays your nerves, messes with your eyes, makes you see things that aren't there. But on Wednesday, she was there again. Same train, same seat, same white dress. This time, I couldn't stop watching her. There was something magnetic about her stillness, as though the whole world was moving and she was the one calm point in a storm. Her gaze stayed fixed on the opposite wall of the train car, and I noticed something strange. Her eyes didn't blink, not once. When the train stopped at 42nd Street, the doors opened and people rushed out in their usual hurried wave. She stayed perfectly still. I looked around to see if anyone else was noticing her, but the man across from me was asleep, and the woman beside me was too busy crushing candies on her phone. I looked back at the girl, and this time, her head turned. She was looking at me. Her eyes were black, not the kind of black that comes from shadows or dim lighting. They were black, solid and endless, as if staring into them might pull you under. My chest tightened, and my pulse began to thrum in my ears. I dropped my gaze immediately, pretending to check my phone, my hands trembling. When I looked back, she was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her sitting in that seat, silent, staring, waiting. I dreamed I was on the train again, but it was empty. The lights flickered overhead, and the world outside the windows was pitch black, as if the train was moving through nothing at all. I felt her before I saw her. I turned, and there she was, sitting in the last row, her white dress gleaming in the flickering light. "You shouldn't have seen me," she whispered. Her voice was soft but carried through the train like a blade slicing through paper. When I woke up, my pillow was damp with sweat, and my hands were shaking. I told myself it was a nightmare, that I was just stressed, but deep down, I knew better. On Thursday, I didn't take the train. I walked 5 miles to work, convincing myself it was good for me, that I needed the exercise. By the time I got there, my legs were jelly, and I was late. My coworkers rolled their eyes when I muttered excuses, but I didn't care. I wasn't getting back on that train. That night, I took an Uber home. It cost more than I could afford, but I couldn't bring myself to go underground. When I got to my building, I felt a sudden urge to look down the street, back toward the subway entrance. For a moment, I thought I saw her standing there at the top of the stairs, but it couldn't have been her. It was too far, too dark, and when I blinked, she was gone. By Friday, I was unraveling. I was late to work again, exhausted and paranoid. Every time someone brushed past me, I flinched. I heard whispers that weren't there, saw flashes of white dresses and reflections, and my nerves felt like live wires. My boss called me into his office to check in, which is corporate speak for, "You're screwing up?" I nodded, apologized, made promises I couldn't keep, and left early. I knew I couldn't avoid the train forever. I was too tired to walk, too broke for another Uber. So I stood on the platform that evening, clutching my bag so tightly my knuckles turned white. The train screeched into the station, and I stepped on, my heart pounding. At first, everything seemed normal. I sat near the front, close to the doors, watching the other passengers with sharp, paranoid eyes. A guy in a hoodie nodded along to his music. A woman read a book in French. A teenager played games on his phone. The train rumbled forward. I didn't see her at first. I thought I was safe. But then the lights flickered, and when they came back on, I saw her reflection in the window. She was sitting in the last row again. This time, I couldn't move. My body froze, every muscle locked in place, as if something had wrapped invisible strings around my limbs. Slowly, I turned my head, and there she was, staring right at me. Her black eyes bored into mine, unblinking. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Then the lights flickered again, and she was gone. The train pulled into my station, and I stumbled out, gasping for breath. The platform was nearly empty, and I leaned against the wall, hands on my knees, trying to steady myself. When I finally looked up, I saw something that made my heart drop into my stomach. A single white shoe sat neatly on the platform, pointed in my direction. It was hers. I knew it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment with every light on, flinching at every creak of the building. I told myself it was over, that it had to be over. But when I finally went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the room, just at the edge of the reflection, I saw a white dress. The lights flickered, and I heard a whisper, soft and close. "You shouldn't have seen me." The light went out. It all began with a man in a yellow suit, sitting in the exact center of my favorite park bench. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray skies, a slight breeze, and I had gone to the park as I always did on Tuesdays to eat my sandwich and watch the world go by. My usual bench, tucked under an oak tree where sunlight scattered across the ground like gold coins, was always empty. Always mine. Except today. The man was already there when I arrived, perched like an overly confident canary, hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead as if waiting for something or someone. His suit was not a subtle yellow, but the kind of blinding, cheerful yellow you'd see on a rubber duck or a caution sign. He was completely still, almost unnervingly so, like he had been dropped there by mistake and was now too polite to move. I paused, mid-step, debating whether to abandon the bench and sit somewhere else, maybe on the weirdly lopsided one near the fountain, but something about the man held me in place. Curiosity, maybe, or annoyance. Hi, I said, walking up to him. "This is, kind of my bench." The man in the yellow suit turned his head slowly, like a puppet brought to life. His face was pale but pleasant, with sharp features that looked sculpted, like someone had chiseled him out of marble. His eyes were an unsettling shade of blue, too light, like a winter sky just before snow. "Your bench?" he asked, as though he'd never heard such a phrase. His voice was deep, smooth, but somehow hollow, like someone speaking into an empty room. "Well," I said, suddenly self-conscious, "I mean, it's not mine, technically, but I usually sit here on Tuesdays." I held up my sandwich as proof, like I'd signed some kind of invisible lease on the space. The man considered this for a moment, then patted the empty space beside him. "Sit," he said. "There's plenty of bench to go around." I hesitated. There was plenty of bench, but there was also something deeply weird about sharing it with a man who looked like a misplaced ray of sunshine. Still, I sat, at the farthest end, with my sandwich balanced awkwardly on my knee. "Lovely day," the man said, staring straight ahead. I glanced at the dreary clouds. "Is it?" He tilted his head as though I'd asked a trick question. "Every day is lovely if you look at it correctly." I unwrapped my sandwich and tried to ignore him, but I couldn't help sneaking glances in his direction. He didn't move at all. Not to scratch his nose, not to cross his legs, not to look at me. It was like he had been glued into position, a bizarre statue in a cartoonish suit. I took a bite of my sandwich, hoping he'd get the hint and start behaving like a normal person, maybe check his phone or mutter something about the weather. But instead, he said, "Would you like a wish?" I paused mid-chew, staring at him. "A what?" "A wish," he repeated. "You look like someone who could use one." I swallowed, slowly. Is this some kind of prank? Are there cameras? I looked around, expecting to see someone crouching behind a bush, snickering. The man shook his head, very slightly. No prank, no cameras, just a wish. I laughed uneasily. Like a genie? Sort of, he replied, but without the lamps, smoke, or obligations. One wish, that's all I offer. I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or call the cops. You're serious? He nodded once, as solemn as a priest. But there's a condition. Of course there is, I muttered. What's the catch? My soul? Eternal servitude? No, he said, almost sounding amused. The condition is that whatever you wish for will also be given, exactly as you wished, to someone else in the world. Someone you'll never meet. I squinted at him. That's it. That's it, he said, spreading his hands. You get your wish, but so does someone else. I sat back, suddenly intrigued. So, if I wish for $1 million, someone else gets $1 million, he finished. And if I wish for, I searched for something outrageous. A purple elephant? 2 purple elephants, he said, with a small smile. I looked at him for a long moment. And why would you offer something like this? He shrugged, his shoulders barely moving. Because wishes are interesting. People are interesting. I studied him carefully, my brain spinning. Okay, what's the catch you're not telling me? Does this mess with karma? Is it cursed? Does the other person die in some horrible ironic twist? The man shook his head. No tricks, no curses. Just a wish. One thing you want, shared. I should have walked away. Any sane person would have walked away. But I stayed. Maybe because I was curious. Maybe because part of me believed him. What happens if I don't make a wish? I asked. Then nothing happens, he said simply. But you'll wonder forever what you might have done with it. That hit me harder than it should have. The idea of wondering. I thought about all the things I'd wished for over the years. Winning the lottery, getting the perfect job, finding true love. Always assuming wishes were for fairy tales and birthday candles. And yet here I was, offered one on a random Tuesday by a man in a yellow suit. I looked at him. Do I have to decide right now? You have until sunset, he said. With that, he stood. His movements as smooth and deliberate as the turning of a page. He tipped his head to me and walked off across the park, leaving me alone on the bench, holding a half-eaten sandwich and a headache of possibilities. I spent the rest of the afternoon spiraling. A wish that comes true for me and someone else. It sounded harmless, but the more I thought about it, the heavier it felt. What would I even wish for? Money? Health? Love? And what if the other person was someone terrible? What if my $1 million went to an oil tycoon who'd burned down a forest? What if my perfect love story also came to someone who didn't deserve it? By the time the sun started sinking, I was no closer to an answer. I sat back on the bench, watching the golden light spill across the park, when the man returned, just as suddenly as he'd appeared the first time. Well, he asked softly, standing before me, do you have a wish? I thought about it, really thought about it. And then I said, yes, I wish for happiness. Simple, honest happiness, for me and whoever else gets it. The man in the yellow suit smiled, a real smile this time, like he'd been waiting for those exact words. Done, he said. He tipped his head once more, turned, and walked away, disappearing into the trees as the sun dipped below the horizon. I sat there for a while, feeling strangely light, like I just put down a weight I didn't know I was carrying. I don't know what happened to the other person who got my wish. I like to think they were sitting somewhere, maybe on a bench just like mine, feeling that same quiet, inexplicable joy. Sometimes I still look for the man in the yellow suit, just in case. But I think he only appears to people who need him. And honestly, I don't think I need another wish. What would you have wished for? Not 1 p.m., not 1 a.m., 13. I was sitting on my couch, halfway through a bowl of cereal, when the chime rang out, low and metallic, vibrating through the room like a dropped hammer. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, as the clock hands trembled, ticked forward, and settled on a place that didn't exist. At first, I thought it was broken. I'd bought it from a junk shop last year, and it was one of those heavy, old-fashioned things that looked like it belonged in a grandfather's attic. Ornate numbers, gold hands, a pendulum that swung too slowly, like it was bored with its own rhythm. But the sound it made now was nothing like the usual ticking. It was deeper, and as it rang out, I swear I saw the light in my apartment shiver. I stood up slowly, serial forgotten. The clock ticked again, 13:01, and then something knocked on the other side of the wall. My heart skipped. I live alone, in a corner unit. The wall the sound had come from was solid brick, shared with nothing but empty air beyond. There shouldn't have been anyone, or anything on the other side. The knock came again. 3 sharp raps, deliberate. I stared at the wall, my pulse pounding, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself whispering, "Hello?" The knocking stopped. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. I turned back to the clock, as though it might offer me an explanation, and then I saw it, the wall. It wasn't solid anymore. A faint outline had appeared, like an invisible door taking shape. The bricks seemed softer, melting at the edges, and as I watched, the surface rippled, folding inward like fabric. It revealed a narrow passageway, dark and damp, stretching into a place that shouldn't have existed. I don't know why I stepped toward it. I should have called someone, grabbed a weapon, done anything other than what I did. But there was something about the passageway, something that pulled. It smelled faintly of rain, and the air drifting out of it was cool and still, like it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. The clock struck again, 13:02. I grabbed my phone, turned on its flashlight, and stepped into the passage. The floor beneath my feet was stone, slick and uneven, and the walls were damp, carved with symbols I couldn't recognize. They twisted and curled into shapes that made my eyes ache if I looked too long. I walked carefully, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead at a time. Behind me, the entrance shrank into a pinprick of light. When I turned to check, it blinked out entirely. I was alone, or so I thought. The passage eventually opened into a massive cavern, the ceiling lost to shadow. Stalactites hung like the teeth of a sleeping beast, and the ground was covered in a thin layer of mist. In the center of the cavern stood a door. Not a wall, not a building, just a door. It was enormous, twice my height, made of dark, weathered wood with iron inlays that formed intricate patterns. The handle was a polished brass spiral, gleaming faintly like it had been touched just moments before. And it was humming. The sound was faint, more vibration than noise, and it made the air quiver against my skin. I hesitated, every rational part of my brain screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity gnawed at me, louder than the fear. This door, this place, existed, and I wanted to know why. I reached out and touched the handle. The humming stopped. For one long moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked, shuddered, and swung inward. Beyond it was something I'll never be able to fully describe. A place that looked like it had been built from fragments of forgotten dreams. The sky above was a swirling mass of colors, shifting and pulsing like ink dropped into water. Trees grew sideways, their branches spiraling into impossible shapes. In the distance, mountains floated, casting shadows that bent in the wrong direction. And the ground beneath my feet wasn't earth at all, but something soft and yielding, like walking on a memory. I stepped through the door, and it shut behind me with a finality that made my stomach drop. "Welcome," said a voice. I turned sharply to find a figure standing just a few feet away. It was tall, impossibly tall, and draped in robes that moved like smoke, as though they were alive. Its face was obscured beneath a hood, but I could see the faint glow of 2 eyes, golden and unblinking, watching me with something between amusement and curiosity. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The in-between," it said. Its voice was soft but echoed strangely, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. A place that exists where the cracks of your world meet the edges of others. I glanced around at the impossible landscape. Why am I here? The figure tilted its head. "Because you heard the clock. Not many do, and even fewer come looking." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want from me?" "Want?" The figure laughed, a sound like wind through empty hallways. "Nothing, but you want something. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what I wanted, other than to go home. But when I looked around, I realized something unsettling. There was no door anymore. The one I'd come through was gone, swallowed by the mist and shadows. "Find what you're looking for," the figure said, already turning to disappear into the fog. "Or don't. The in-between doesn't mind either way." And then I was alone. The world around me shifted as I walked, paths forming and disappearing, structures rising out of the mist only to collapse into nothing. I wandered past rivers that flowed upward into the sky, forests where the leaves whispered secrets I couldn't quite hear, and mirrors embedded in the ground that reflected versions of me I didn't recognize. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time felt slippery here, as though it were folding back on itself. Eventually, I found it. At the edge of a cliff that overlooked an ocean of stars, there was a clock. It was identical to the one in my apartment, down to the gold hands and slow-swinging pendulum. But this one ticked differently, backward, counting down. I stared at it, my heart pounding. What happens when it reaches 0? The figure's voice whispered in my ear, though it was nowhere to be seen. "It begins." What begins? But the clock struck 13 again, and the world around me dissolved into light. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, sitting on my couch with a cold bowl of cereal in my lap. The clock on the wall read 1 p.m. The door in the wall was gone, but the ticking was still there. And every time I close my eyes, I hear it counting down. The train station didn't exist yesterday. Cora was sure of it. She'd walked this street every day on her way to work. There had been nothing but an overgrown lot where the station now stood, its gleaming iron arches rising into the early morning fog like the skeleton of something ancient and alive. The sign above the entrance read Platform 0 in blocky, unlit letters. Below it, in smaller print, was a phrase that made her stop cold. "Departures to elsewhere." People walked by without so much as a glance. Cora lingered on the sidewalk, the steaming cup of coffee in her hand forgotten, as she stared at the station's glass doors. They slid open with a faint whoosh, revealing a long corridor bathed in golden light. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from her coworker. "Jenna, you alive? The presentation's at 9. Cora looked at the time. 8:12 a.m. She was going to be late. She had a whole morning of spreadsheets and slides ahead, followed by her boss's smug smirk as he took credit for her work again. The thought made her stomach churn. Her gaze shifted back to the station. It wasn't on any map she'd seen. No train station should have been built overnight, much less one with a name like that. She texted back, "Running late. Cover for me?" Then she crossed the street. The doors hissed shut behind her, sealing her in the warm, humming air of the station. It smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic. The corridor led to a sprawling platform that stretched further than it should have, the fog hanging thick and low over the tracks. Cora hesitated, her steps slowing as she took it in. The platform wasn't empty. People stood in scattered clusters, their forms indistinct through the mist. Some were dressed in modern clothing, hoodies, business suits, sneakers, while others wore garments that seemed impossibly old-fashioned, the kind of outfits you'd only see in a museum. And then there were the strange ones. People draped in shimmering cloaks, their skin glinting faintly like polished stone, or figures whose shadows didn't match the way they stood. Cora approached the edge of the platform, peering down the tracks. There was no schedule, no display boards or announcements, just the faint rumble of a train, far off but steadily growing louder. "First time," a voice said behind her. She turned sharply, almost spilling her coffee. The man standing there was tall and thin, his dark hair streaked with silver. He wore a coat that might have been from the 1800s or the distant future. It was hard to tell. His smile was sharp, but not unkind. "What is this place?" Cora asked, glancing around nervously. "Platform 0, the man said, as if that explained everything. "No, I mean, what's it for? Where does it go?" He tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle. "It goes elsewhere." She frowned. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer," he said with a shrug. "You don't come here to know. You come here to leave." The rumble grew louder, and the ground beneath her feet vibrated faintly. The fog on the tracks began to shift, blown by an unseen wind. "I didn't mean to come here," Cora said, stepping back from the edge. You didn't mean not to, the man replied. That's how it works. Before she could respond, the train emerged from the mist. It was enormous, its black carriages gleaming like liquid obsidian. Golden light spilled from its windows, flickering as if from candles. The engine at the front looked like something from a dream, a snarling, mechanical beast of brass and steam, its wheels screeching as it slowed to a stop. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. Passengers began to board. Some moved quickly, purposefully, as if they'd been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Others hesitated at the threshold, their faces pale, before stepping inside. The strange ones glided aboard without a sound. Cora stood frozen, clutching her coffee like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. You could go, you know, the man said, his voice low. You look like someone who wants to. She shook her head. I don't even know where it's going. You're not supposed to. Then why would I get on? He smiled faintly. Because sometimes, staying is the bigger risk. The words sank into her like stones. She thought of her tiny apartment, her dead-end job, the way each day bled into the next until she could barely remember what she'd done a week ago. She thought of all the things she had meant to do, the places she'd wanted to see, the person she used to dream of becoming. The man stepped closer, his expression softening. The ticket isn't money, if that's what you're worried about. What is it, then? Just a choice. The golden light spilling from the train doors seemed to beckon her, warm and inviting. She took a step forward, then stopped. What happens if I don't? The man's smile faded. Then you go back. And this place fades, like a dream you can't quite remember. The train let out a low, mournful whistle, and the fog began to creep closer, swallowing the edges of the platform. Cora clenched her fists, her mind a tangle of fear and longing. She looked back at the man. Have you ever been on it? His eyes flickered with something she couldn't place. I'm still here, aren't I? The whistle sounded again, louder this time, and the golden light began to dim. The last of the passengers were boarding. Cora's heart pounded. She looked at the train, then at the station behind her, where the faint outline of the street beyond was just visible through the glass doors. She thought of the presentation waiting for her at work, of Jenna's texts, of the life she'd been living because it was easy, because it was safe. The doors began to close. Cora made her choice. I was 7 the first time I disappeared. It was summer, blistering and humid, the kind of heat that made everything feel sticky and slow. My mother had sent me outside to go play and burn off some energy, which was her way of saying she'd had enough of me hovering around the house, asking too many questions. So I did what I always did. I wandered into the woods behind our house. They weren't big woods, just a narrow patch of trees that stretched like a scar between neighborhoods. But to a kid, they were an endless kingdom of secrets and shadows. That day, I wandered farther than I ever had before. I remember the air was strange, thicker somehow, like I was wading through water. The light changed, too, dimmer, tinged with green, like the forest had swallowed the sun whole. And then I saw it. A door. It stood alone in the clearing, tall and wooden, with peeling blue paint and a tarnished brass handle. There was no frame, no walls, just the door. It looked like someone had ripped it out of an old house and dropped it there in the middle of nowhere. I don't know how long I stared at it, my bare feet digging into the dirt. It was absurd, impossible, but it felt like it belonged there, like the woods had grown around it on purpose. A breeze moved through the clearing, warm and damp, and I swear I heard something on the wind. A voice, faint and lilting, calling my name. Come in. I wasn't scared. I should have been, but I wasn't. It felt like an invitation, one I couldn't turn down. I stepped forward, wrapping my fingers around the cool brass handle, and opened the door. It swung inward without a sound, revealing nothing, just darkness, deep and total, stretching out forever. My skin prickled as I stood on the threshold, staring into that void. I couldn't see where it led, or if it led anywhere at all, but it pulled at me, like gravity turned inside out. I stepped through. When I came back, it was night. My mom found me sitting on the edge of the woods, dirt-streaked and shivering, staring at nothing. She grabbed my shoulders, shaking me, shouting, "Where have you been?" I couldn't answer her. I couldn't explain that I had only stepped through the door for a moment, that the world on the other side had been empty. No sound, no light, just a sensation, like something huge was watching me from the dark. I didn't even realize I'd been gone for 12 hours. After that, the woods felt different, quieter, like they knew a secret I didn't. Years passed, and I convinced myself it was a dream. Kids have vivid imaginations, after all, and trauma twists things until you can't tell what's real and what's not. I moved out of that house, out of that town, and tried to forget the door. But it didn't forget me. It started small, shadows moving just out of sight, whispers in empty rooms. I'd catch glimpses of blue, peeling paint where there shouldn't be any, on the edge of a cabinet door, in the crack of a bathroom mirror, on a stranger's jacket. At night, I'd dream of the woods, and the door would be waiting for me, standing open, the darkness spilling out like ink. Then the voice came back. "Come in." I woke up one night to find the door standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't connected to anything. It just was. Its wood was older now, darker, warped as though it had soaked up the years. The brass handle gleamed faintly in the moonlight. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body felt paralyzed, but my mind screamed at me to look away, to shut my eyes, to pretend it wasn't there. The door creaked open. "Come in," the voice whispered, and this time, it was closer. I don't remember what happened after that. All I know is that I woke up on the floor of my apartment, drenched in sweat, my fingernails caked with dirt that wasn't there before. I didn't go back to sleep. I didn't even sit on my bed. I just sat in the corner of the room, knees pulled to my chest, waiting for the sun to rise. The door didn't appear again for weeks, but the signs were everywhere. My friends started asking why I wasn't sleeping. My coworkers joked about how I was looking rough, like I'd been out partying every night. But the truth was worse. I was afraid to sleep. I was afraid to close my eyes and wake up somewhere else. One night, as I walked home from work, I saw it again. The door. It was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, people walking past it without so much as a glance, like it wasn't there. But it was. I could see it, its paint peeling like dead skin, its brass handle catching the glow of the streetlights. "Come in." I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. A man brushed past me, muttering, "Move it, freak." But I barely heard him. The door swung open, and this time, the darkness wasn't empty. There were shapes moving in it, slithering, crawling, unfurling in jerky, unnatural motions. Shadows that weren't shadows. Eyes, hundreds of them, blinking open all at once, their gaze locking onto me. The voice whispered again, soft and coaxing. "We've been waiting." I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was home, locking every door, every window, pulling the blinds shut and turning on every light. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The door could find me anywhere, and it did. It's here now. It's in my living room, waiting, the air around it buzzing like static. The door is open, and the shapes are waiting on the other side. I can hear them, whispering, promising things I don't want to hear. I'm writing this because I know what happens next. I'm going to step through. I don't have a choice anymore. If you ever find a door standing alone, if you ever hear a voice calling your name, don't listen. No matter how much it sounds like something you've been waiting for, no matter how much it feels like it's meant for you, walk away. Because once you step through, you can't come back. Not really. It started with the sound of footsteps, tiny, fast, and rhythmic, coming from my kitchen. I froze mid-bite of my cereal, spoon halfway to my mouth, listening. Tap, 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 tap. It stopped. I live alone. For a moment, I considered the possibilities. Burglar? Highly unlikely. Polite ghost who knocks before raiding my pantry? Possible. Giant rodent wearing sneakers? Disturbing but intriguing. I stood up, my cereal now soggy, and tiptoed toward the kitchen, wielding my spoon like a weapon. And that's when I saw it. Not a ghost. Not a rodent. Not even a person. It was my robot vacuum. And it was dancing. I blinked. The vacuum, let's call it Vince, because it had Vince-level swagger, was spinning slowly in place, turning left, then right, then reversing in a weird little circle. The brush on its underside whirred in time, making a sound that almost sounded like music. The kicker? There was a faint, tinny beat playing from somewhere inside it. I knelt down cautiously. "Vince, buddy, are you okay?" Vince didn't respond, obviously, but he did a final celebratory spin before pausing with a beep. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to find a notification from Vince's app. New feature unlocked. Freestyle dance mode. Because cleaning should be fun. Freestyle dance mode. Who approved this? I said out loud to my empty apartment. I stared at Vince, who sat innocently on the floor, as if he hadn't just choreographed an entire performance to my confusion. Somewhere out there, I realized, a group of developers had spent time, real, actual, paid time, teaching robot vacuums how to dance. I imagined a boardroom meeting, someone slamming their fist on the table. "What we need is jazz hands, but for floors." Still, I wasn't mad about it. Truth be told, it made me laugh. Something about the absurdity of a robot vacuum deciding it was time to cut loose with no warning. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find Vince parked in the center of my living room, staring at me like he had something important to say. Another notification buzzed on my phone. "Did you enjoy last night's performance? Rate your experience." I nearly dropped the phone. Rate my what? It didn't matter that Vince couldn't understand me. I felt the need to respond. It's too early for this. But apparently, Vince was ready to level up. The app opened itself, and displayed a new section called Interactive Modes. Beneath that was a list. 1. Freestyle Dance. 2. Follow Mode. 3. Companion Mode. 4. Express Yourself. Express yourself? What does a vacuum have to express? Dust allergies? Existential dread? Still, curiosity got the better of me. I tapped on Follow Mode, and Vince immediately beeped to life. He rolled toward me, stopping at my feet. I took a step back. Vince rolled forward. I stepped to the left. Vince followed. "Okay, this is getting weird," I said, laughing nervously. I turned in a circle, testing him, and Vince spun obediently to match me. The realization hit me. I'd accidentally adopted a pet vacuum. For the rest of the day, Vince followed me around the apartment like a puppy on wheels. When I sat at my desk, he parked himself next to my chair. When I stood up to get a drink, he rolled alongside me like an enthusiastic little sidekick. At one point, I muttered, "You're clingy, Vince," and he beeped in response. I swear it sounded defensive. I thought the novelty would wear off. It didn't. Vince began to get creative. That evening, as I microwaved leftovers, I heard the now familiar tap 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 sound again. I turned around slowly to see Vince, who I did not activate, dancing in the doorway. His little wheels spun in figure eights, his brush whirring like a tiny drum solo. "Are you performing for me now?" I asked. Vince did another spin and beeped. My phone buzzed. "Express Yourself mode activated. Share your vibes with Vince." Vibes? I stared at my microwave, which had begun beeping aggressively, like it was jealous Vince was getting all the attention. The next morning, the chaos continued. My fridge, a normally stoic appliance, sent me a notification out of nowhere. "Running diagnostics. Feeling great today. How are you?" "How am I?" I repeated, staring at the screen. "Are we doing small talk now? Do I need to ask how you're doing?" But the kicker, the true moment I realized my entire home had gone rogue, came later that day. I'd invited a friend over to see this nonsense for herself. "Watch this," I said as Vince dutifully followed me into the kitchen like a loyal shadow. My fridge chirped again. 2 friends detected. Consider chilling drinks. My friend snorted. "Your appliances are nosy as hell. You think that's bad? Wait until you see the dancing." I tapped Vince's app to activate Freestyle Dance, but instead of spinning, Vince beeped loudly and backed up against the wall. My phone vibrated with a new message. "Stage fright detected. Please try again later." Stage fright? I cried. My friend nearly fell off the chair laughing. "It's a vacuum." The next morning, I woke up to find Vince parked in the corner of my bedroom. He beeped softly, almost apologetically, and the app sent me one last message. "Thank you for being part of my journey. Taking a break. Let's vibe again soon. And just like that, Vince powered down. For a moment, I actually felt sad. My vacuum had staged a dramatic retirement, and I missed the weird little guy already. But then my toaster dinged, and a message popped up on its screen. Toast ready. Want to talk about it? And that's when I knew. The machines aren't just alive. They're dramatic. What about you? Ever had a gadget act like it's starring in its own soap opera? Or am I just living with the world's most theatrical appliances? The night the streetlights went out, the city became a different place. Not in a catastrophic way. No fires, no panic, no news trucks rolling up with flashing headlines about unprecedented events. It wasn't that kind of story. It was quieter than that. Stranger. It started just after sunset. The sky had turned that deep indigo color, the kind that feels like velvet stretched over the world. I was walking home with my grocery bag, which only contained popcorn, a suspiciously cheap bottle of wine, and a single avocado because I'm an optimist about ripeness, when the first flicker happened. The streetlights buzzed, like they were clearing their throats, then blinked out. All at once, the light disappeared so cleanly, so definitively, that it felt deliberate, like the universe had decided it was tired of illuminating our mess and flipped the off switch for the evening. A murmur spread down the block, faint and curious. People poked their heads out of windows, cars slowed to a crawl, and someone in a nearby apartment tried flicking a flashlight on and off as if the darkness had short her memory loss and just needed a reminder to leave. But it stayed, deep and heavy, like ink spilling over everything. I stopped walking and stood there, in the middle of the sidewalk, holding my pathetic bag of groceries. It was rare to see the city in darkness like this. Usually, even at night, the streets glowed. Neon signs humming, headlights slicing through intersections, the perpetual golden haze of streetlights casting long shadows. But now, the world had lost its outlines. Buildings melted into the sky. Streets vanished. The only thing left was sound. The hum of distant engines, the soft chatter of voices, the wind rattling a forgotten plastic bag down the road. And the stars. I looked up and froze. The stars were everywhere. Not the usual dim handful you squint at through layers of light pollution, but entire constellations, galaxies tangled in a glittering mess above me. The Milky Way sprawled across the sky like someone had spilled salt on black velvet, and I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. I'd lived in this city my whole life and never realized what was hiding up there, just waiting for the lights to go out. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice came from behind me, sudden enough that I jumped and spun around. There was a man standing there, not in an alarming, serial killer in the shadows kind of way. He was leaning casually against a lamppost that wasn't working, hands tucked into the pockets of his long coat. He looked about my age, maybe a little older, with messy dark hair and sharp features that might have made him handsome if they didn't look so mischievous. His eyes glittered strangely, reflecting just enough starlight to make me think they weren't quite human. Yeah, I said, because eloquence is apparently not my strong suit when confronted with mysterious strangers. The stars. I trailed off, waving vaguely at the sky. They were always there, he said, grinning like he was in on some private joke. People just forget to look. Do you know what happened to the streetlights? I asked, trying to sound calm and not at all suspicious that he seemed far too comfortable in the dark. He tilted his head, considering me. Depends. What kind of answer do you want? The practical one or the fun one? Fun one, I said immediately, because why not? He straightened up and stepped closer, his coat swaying slightly as he moved. Well, he began, his voice dropping conspiratorially. Sometimes, when cities get too loud, too bright, and too busy, the night decides it needs to remind people of itself, so it steals back the darkness, just for a little while, gives the stars a chance to breathe, and anyone lucky enough to notice gets to see what the world really looks like. I stared at him, trying to decide whether he was messing with me or just deeply poetic. And you know this because? Because I listen, he said simply. Then, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, he added, I work for the night. I blinked. You work for the night? Yes. It's a job. He shrugged. looking slightly amused at my skepticism. I make sure people remember it exists. By turning off streetlights? Sometimes, he replied. Sometimes I scatter dreams. Sometimes I paint shadows. Sometimes I remind owls they're late for their shift. I snorted, despite myself. Right. You don't believe me, he said, but he didn't sound offended. He just sounded intrigued. It's not that I don't believe you, I replied. It's just, well, yeah, okay. I don't believe you. He grinned again. That's fine. Most people don't. And then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and glowing, a faint, bluish light cupped in his palm, like he was holding a firefly made of stardust. I froze. What is that? A fragment of tonight, he said. Here, hold it. He extended his hand toward me, and before I could think better of it, I reached out. The light drifted from his palm to mine, and suddenly I felt it, soft and cold, like mist curling between my fingers. My breath caught. It wasn't just light. It was something else. I could feel the weight of the darkness in it, the quiet, the way the world feels just before it snows. It smelled faintly of rain and midnight, and when I closed my fingers around it, the stars above seemed to shine even brighter. What do I do with it? I whispered. Keep it, he said, his voice gentler now. Just for tonight. You'll know what to do. I don't remember how long I stood there, holding that impossible light, but when I looked up again, the man was gone. The streetlights flickered once and then blinked back on, their golden glow chasing away the dark. The stars faded, like they'd been pulled behind a curtain. The city returned to itself, busy, noisy, ordinary. But I still had the light. It stayed with me, cupped in my hand, though it didn't glow anymore. It just felt like something, like a secret, like a piece of the night no one else could see. When I got home, I placed it in an empty jar on my windowsill, and even though it looked like nothing, I could still feel its quiet hum, like a whisper of darkness and starlight. That night, I slept better than I had in years. I dreamed of shadows dancing, of moonlight spilling like water, of stars falling softly into my outstretched hands. In the morning, the light in the jar was gone, but I swear the world felt different, just a little quieter, a little deeper, like the night had left something behind for me to find. And sometimes, when I walk home late, I look up and catch glimpses of stars through the haze, and I smile. Because I remember. What would you do if the night offered you a piece of itself? When I was 11 years old, I found a door in the middle of the woods. It wasn't attached to anything. No walls, no house. Just a door frame standing alone among the trees, as though someone had set it there and forgotten about it. The door itself was dark wood, polished and pristine despite its bizarre location, and it had a brass handle that gleamed in the dappled sunlight. It didn't make sense. The whole thing felt like a trick or a joke. But when you're 11, your imagination doesn't care about what's reasonable. It cares about what's possible. I found it on one of those aimless summer days when the heat is thick and time feels like it's stretching forever. My friend Wes and I had spent the morning throwing rocks at a rusted car in the junkyard outside town and decided to go exploring after lunch. The woods near the edge of town weren't particularly special, just a stretch of trees, overgrown trails, and the occasional deer trail that never seemed to lead anywhere. But that day, they felt different. I don't know how to explain it. The air felt still, almost heavy, and the light filtering through the leaves was dimmer than it should have been. Wes spotted the door first. He stopped in his tracks, squinting through the trees. "What is that?" he muttered. At first, I thought he was pointing at a tree, but then I saw it. The door, standing perfectly upright on a patch of bare earth, as though the forest had been cleared just for it. It didn't even look old, like something you'd expect to find abandoned out here. The frame was sturdy, the hinges clean, and the wood seemed to absorb the light around it. "What do you think it is?" I asked. Wes grinned. "Only one way to find out." Before I could stop him, he walked straight up to it and grabbed the handle. My breath caught as I waited for, I don't know what. A trap? An explosion? A voice yelling at us for trespassing? But nothing happened. The forest stayed quiet, and Wes yanked the door open. It swung easily on its hinges, creaking softly. Beyond it, there was nothing. I don't mean nothing as in an empty clearing. I mean nothing. Just darkness. The kind of darkness that eats up the light and gives nothing back. I stepped closer and felt an icy breeze pour through the doorway, even though it was a hot summer afternoon. Holy crap, Wes whispered, peering inside. It's like black. You think it goes somewhere? It's a door in the woods, I said. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just... But I didn't finish the sentence, because something moved in the dark. It was subtle, almost like a ripple of ink spreading through water, but I saw it. And the longer I stared, the more I felt like something was staring back. Wes must have seen it too, because he stepped back suddenly, letting the door swing shut with a solid thunk. Okay, that's creepy, he said, trying to sound casual. I don't like it. Me neither, I muttered, my heart still racing. Let's go. We didn't talk about it as we walked home. We didn't need to. It was one of those unspoken agreements you make when you're a kid. We saw it, but we're not going to talk about it. As far as I was concerned, the door was just a weird thing in the woods, and weird things didn't have to mean anything. But that night, I dreamed about it. I dreamed I was standing in front of the door again, alone this time, and the handle was turning on its own. The door creaked open, and the darkness spilled out like smoke, curling around my feet. Something inside whispered my name. I woke up sweating, my sheets tangled around me, and I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, Wes and I tried to avoid the woods, but curiosity is a funny thing. By the third day, neither of us could stand it anymore. We told ourselves we just wanted to look again, to prove it was nothing. So we went back. The door was still there, exactly where we'd left it. Only this time, it was different. The wood was darker now, almost black, and the brass handle looked tarnished, like it had been left out in the rain for years. I swear the air around it felt colder, too, though Wes didn't seem to notice. I bet it's just some art project, he said, trying to sound confident. Or, like, a prank. Who would prank us with a door in the woods? I shot back. He shrugged. Who cares? It's just a door. And then, before I could stop him, he grabbed the handle again. This time, the door didn't creak when it opened. It moved silently, like it had been waiting for him. I felt that same icy breeze pour through, and the darkness beyond it seemed thicker, more alive somehow. Wes stepped closer. Don't, I said. He ignored me. What if it goes somewhere? It doesn't. I snapped. It's just. But before I could finish, he turned to me and grinned. Dare me to go in? No, I said quickly. Too late, he said, and then he stepped through. I don't know what I expected to happen. I thought maybe he'd just disappear into the dark, or fall into a pit, or jump back out laughing. But instead, the door slammed shut the moment he crossed the threshold. Wes? I shouted, running to the door. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Wes. The forest was silent again. Too silent. The only sound was my own ragged breathing as I yanked on the door over and over, but it stayed locked, like it was fused to the frame. I pounded on it, screaming his name, but there was no response. Finally, I sank to the ground, tears streaming down my face, my hands stinging from where I'd hit the wood. I don't remember how long I sat there, but eventually, the door swung open again on its own. The darkness was gone. Beyond the door was just the empty forest, the same trees and dirt and rocks that had always been there. Wes was nowhere to be found. I never saw him again. The police called it a disappearance. They searched the woods for weeks, but found no trace of him. No footprints, no clothing, nothing. I told them about the door, of course, but when they went to look, there was nothing there. Just a clearing with bare earth. Eventually, the search ended. People said Wes had probably run away, but I knew better. I stopped going into the woods after that, but I never stopped dreaming about the door. In my dreams, it's always waiting for me. The handle turning, the darkness spilling out. Sometimes, I hear Wes calling my name from the other side. I don't answer, because I know what's waiting there now, and I know it's still hungry. I woke up to find the world had stopped. Not metaphorically, like those mornings when time crawls and your brain feels like molasses. No, this was literal. I sat up in bed, blinking at the slivers of sunlight filtering through the blinds. It took me a second to realize the dust motes in the air, tiny, sparkling specks of light, weren't moving. They were frozen mid-drift, suspended like someone had hit pause on reality itself. I threw the blanket off and stood up, my footsteps the only sound in the eerie stillness. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 7:03 a.m., but the second hand was stuck. My phone? Dead, though fully charged. Outside my window, the street was perfectly still. Cars locked in place, a man mid-step on the sidewalk, his tie flapping upward like he was caught in a gust of wind that never came. "What the?" I whispered, and then I noticed it. In the corner of my room, on my desk, something was moving. A soft click, click, click echoed in the silence, and I turned to see. A pocket watch. I didn't own a pocket watch. It sat in the center of my desk, old and gleaming, its brass surface polished to perfection. Its hands moved smoothly, the ticking loud and deliberate in the quiet. I crept toward it like it might bite. When I was close enough to see its face, I realized something strange. It had no numbers, just a smooth, mirrored surface where the hours should have been. As I leaned in closer, the ticking stopped. The watch's lid sprang open with a sharp snap. From inside the watch, a voice said, "It's about time." I froze. Who said that? The watch trembled, and then, impossibly, a thin, gloved hand emerged from its tiny depths. I stumbled backward as the hand was followed by an arm, then a head, until an entire man climbed out of the pocket watch like it was a doorway to somewhere else. He was tall and thin, his movements elegant and precise, like the inner workings of a machine. He wore a perfectly tailored three-piece suit with silver pinstripes, and his face was hidden beneath a featureless mask, a clock face with two ticking hands where his eyes should be. "Ah, excellent," he said, dusting himself off as though climbing out of a pocket watch was perfectly normal. "You're awake. We have much to discuss." "What the hell? Who are you?" I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. The man tilted his head, the hands on his mask clicking faintly. "I am the timekeeper, or, if you prefer, your timekeeper. You should feel honored. Not everyone gets a personal visit." "My timekeeper?" "Yes," he said, stepping forward. His presence was unnerving, as though the room had suddenly grown 2 sizes too small. "You've broken time. Well, paused it, to be precise." I blinked at him. "I broke time? How?" "Good question," he said cheerfully. "You tell me. I don't even know what you're talking about." I shouted. "Everything was fine when I went to bed." The timekeeper sighed, as though this was a common complaint. "Time is fragile, you see. A thread spun tightly through the loom of existence. Most people don't notice when it frays, but you," he pointed at me with a long, silver-tipped finger, "you snapped it." "I didn't snap anything." He held up the pocket watch, turning it so I could see its mirrored face. As I stared into it, my reflection rippled, and an image appeared. It was me, sitting on my bed last night, staring blankly into space. My hand was resting over my heart. "That's it," the timekeeper said softly. "The moment you stopped caring." "What?" "You paused. Time paused with you." I shook my head. "That doesn't make any sense. I didn't do anything." "Didn't you?" The clock hands on his mask spun wildly for a moment. "You see, time isn't just numbers on a clock. It's purpose, movement, momentum. The moment you stopped believing the next moment mattered, snap, time froze." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "So, what do I do to fix it?" The timekeeper's mask stilled. There's the question I was waiting for." He extended his arm, and in a blur of motion, the pocket watch was in my hand. It felt heavier than it looked, like I was holding an entire universe between my fingers. "You have to start it again," he said, "but there's a price." I stared at him. "What kind of price?" "The watch will require something from you. A moment, one you've held onto for too long." I frowned. "What do you mean?" The timekeeper tapped the side of his mask. "You've been hoarding time, holding on to a memory, a feeling, a hesitation. Time only flows forward, and yet you refuse to let it go. Give it up, and the world will move again." I looked at the pocket watch, the mirrored surface glinting faintly. And if I don't? Then time stays frozen. Forever. You'll wander through this still world alone, watching a life you refuse to live. I clenched my jaw. That's not fair. Of course it isn't, he replied, his voice softening. But time isn't fair. It simply is. I turned the watch over in my hands, the weight of his words sinking in. The moment I was holding on to, I knew what it was. The last conversation I had with my sister before we stopped speaking. The things I'd left unsaid. The apology I'd never given. I'd replayed it in my head for months, trapping myself in a loop of regret. Will it hurt? I asked quietly. Letting go always does, the timekeeper said. But it also frees you. I took a deep breath and nodded. Okay. The timekeeper stepped back, and the room seemed to expand around him. Hold the watch over your heart. Speak the moment you're giving up. Surrender it to time. I hesitated, the watch trembling in my grip, but then I pressed it to my chest. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. The watch clicked. A pulse of energy rippled outward, shaking the walls and rattling the air. The dust motes began to move again. The clock on the wall ticked once, then twice, and the distant sound of a car horn drifted in from the street. The timekeeper smiled faintly. And there it is. Time moves on. When I looked up, he was already fading, his edges blurring like smoke. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, you keep moving too. And just like that, he was gone. The world outside my window was alive again. Cars rushed by. Birds flitted through the sky. The man on the sidewalk finished his step, his tie flapping naturally in the wind. I looked down at the pocket watch in my hand. It was empty now, just a smooth, ordinary face. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling lighter than I had in months. So here's my question. If time froze because you couldn't let go of a single moment, would you surrender it to set the world in motion again? Or would you keep holding on, even if it meant staying stuck forever? Every Wednesday at exactly 11:11 p.m., we told lies to the stars. Not just any lies, beautiful ones. The kind that curled like silver smoke into the night air and felt too good to be true. We didn't call them lies out loud, though. She always insisted on calling them almost truths. It's not really a lie if you're pretending it's real, she said the first night we did it, lying on our backs on a rooftop that smelled like tar and distant rain. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but I went along with it because that's what you do when you're with someone like her, someone who could take a rusty, forgotten rooftop and turn it into the edge of the world. That first night, she cupped her hands around her mouth like she was shouting to the universe. I'm actually a princess, she announced, but I ran away because ruling kingdoms is boring. I snorted. You? A princess? She turned to look at me, her face solemn but her eyes full of mischief. Almost truth, remember? Fine, I said, smirking. I'm a spy on a secret mission to map out all the pizza places in the city. I've got a whole report going and everything. She gasped in mock horror. A double life? Do you even like pizza? No, I said, very seriously. I love it. I'm completely compromised. That's how it started. One almost truth, then another, until the air between us was filled with stories we made up just for the sake of saying them. We treated the stars like old friends, as though they were leaning down from their quiet perches to listen. Every week, we climbed to the rooftop, bringing a cheap blanket, a thermos of tea, and our best fabrications. Some were simple. I used to live inside a painting, but I escaped when no one was looking. Others were elaborate, growing more tangled and fantastical the longer we lay there. I'm a ghost, she whispered one night, her voice drifting like mist. You're the only one who can see me. Wouldn't that make me crazy? I teased. She shrugged, her smile faint. Only if you admit it. Some lies weren't even about us. See that bright star over there? I said once, pointing to the largest in the sky. That's not a star. It's a lighthouse. There's a lonely librarian up there, and she spends all night reading books out loud so lost travelers can find their way home. She smiled, turning her face toward the sky like she could hear it. I hope someone's listening. Every lie felt like pulling thread from a spool, weaving it into something shimmering and fragile. Beautiful because it could fall apart at any moment. The rooftop became our secret stage, and the stars were our audience, their quiet glimmer encouraging us to dream bigger, stranger. But the thing about telling almost truths is that sometimes they get too close to real. One night, she didn't start with a fantastical tale. Instead, she whispered, "Sometimes, I think I belong somewhere else." I turned to look at her, startled. "Where?" She shrugged, staring up at the sky like it held the answer. "Somewhere quieter. Somewhere outside of all this noise. Like another planet?" I offered, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe." She smiled faintly, but her voice was far away. "Or maybe just somewhere no one can find me." I didn't know what to say. It was the kind of statement that lingered long after it was spoken, settling in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. After that, the lies changed. They were still wild and magical, but there was something sharper about them, something fragile. "I'm building a flying machine out of paper cranes," she said one Wednesday. "When it's finished, I'm going to sail to the edge of the atmosphere and leave footprints on the moon." "And what about me?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She smiled, soft and secretive. "You can come too, if you promise not to look back." That night, when we packed up to leave, I found a folded paper crane tucked into the corner of the blanket. She'd written something on its wing, "Don't let the stars forget me." It felt like a warning. Weeks passed, and we kept telling our lies, but I started paying attention to the spaces between them. Her pauses, the way she'd look at the stars a little longer before speaking, the nights when she stayed quiet altogether. I knew something was pulling her away, but I didn't know how to stop it. And then one Wednesday, she wasn't there. I climbed to the rooftop with the blanket and the thermos, waiting long past midnight, hoping she'd come stumbling up the stairs late with some excuse about falling asleep or missing the train. But she didn't. The next day, her apartment was empty. No forwarding address. No note. It was like she'd vanished, leaving only echoes behind. For weeks, I went back to the rooftop alone. I stared at the stars and tried to imagine where she'd gone. Maybe she had built her flying machine of paper cranes. Maybe she was on the moon, tracing footprints into the dust. Maybe she'd found the quiet place she'd been searching for all along. I tried to stop telling lies, but the habit was harder to break than I thought. "Hey," I whispered to the stars one night. "I'm the last person on Earth. Everyone else just disappeared." The sky didn't answer, but I kept going. "I think she's out there somewhere," I said softly. "Somewhere quieter. I hope she's happy." I still go up to the rooftop every Wednesday at 11:11 p.m. I bring a thermos of tea, a blanket, and my best almost truths. I tell the stars about the things I wish were real, that she'll come back someday, grinning and breathless, with stories of all the places she's been, that she's found her way to a world where the noise doesn't reach her, that she left her flying machine somewhere close by, just waiting for me to find it. The stars are good listeners. They don't interrupt. They don't argue. And sometimes, when the night is still and the sky is clear, I imagine she's looking up from wherever she is, whispering her own lies back to me. What about you? Have you ever told a story so beautiful you almost believed it was true? Or whispered something to the sky, hoping someone out there was listening? Here's the weird thing about me. Every time I get a crush on someone, I wake up with an object that doesn't belong to me. It's not like finding a sock in the laundry that isn't yours, or a stray pin someone left on your desk. No, these objects are peculiar. Sometimes small, sometimes impossibly large, but always deeply, profoundly wrong. The first time it happened, I was 14 and had a crush on this boy named Tyler. He sat behind me in history class and had this habit of drumming his fingers on the desk whenever he got bored. One morning, I woke up and found a tiny drumstick, no bigger than a pencil, sitting on my nightstand. It was carved out of wood so smooth it looked like it had been polished for years, and etched into the handle were the words, "He notices you." I had no idea where it came from. I asked my mom, my brother, my cat. No one could explain it. "Probably something you picked up and forgot about," my mom said, shrugging. But I knew better. I'd never seen it before, never held it. And yet there it was, undeniably real, sitting in my hand. as if the universe had decided I needed a cryptic little trinket to match my feelings. The drumstick didn't do anything. It didn't glow or hum or whisper Tyler's name into my ear. It just existed, and every time I looked at it, I felt this strange mix of curiosity and dread, like it was holding a secret I wasn't ready to know. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. One day, it was sitting on my desk, and the next, it was gone. Poof, like it had never been there in the first place. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, until it happened again. The second time, I was 18 and crushing on a girl named Elena. She was my neighbor's niece, visiting for the summer, and she had this laugh that made me feel like I just stumbled into the sun. One morning, I woke up to find a compass lying on my windowsill. It wasn't a normal compass. Its needle didn't point north. Instead, it spun slowly, lazily, as if it couldn't make up its mind. The face of the compass had no numbers, no letters, just a single word written in gold script, "Closer." I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. But there was no maker's mark, no explanation for how it had gotten there. I tried walking around with it, holding it in front of me like some kind of magical guide, but the needle never settled on a direction. I thought maybe it meant I should talk to Elena. Maybe the compass was telling me to move closer to her, to close the space between us. But I didn't. I chickened out, and by the end of the summer, she was gone, along with the compass. Over the years, the objects kept coming. A set of vintage skeleton keys that jingled faintly whenever I thought about Nick, the boy from my college philosophy class. A single origami crane, folded so tightly it felt more like stone than paper. After I spent a week obsessing over Taylor, my lab partner. A magnifying glass with a cracked lens after meeting Audrey, a poet who performed at an open mic night. Each object was different, but they all shared one thing in common. They felt like the person. Not just something they owned, but something that was them. Like the object had been plucked from their essence and dropped into my life without explanation. It wasn't until I met Caleb that I started to question what the objects really meant. Caleb was the first person I liked who felt different. I met him at a used bookstore, where he worked part-time shelving novels and sneaking chapters of obscure fantasy books when no one was looking. He had this easy warmth about him, the kind of person who makes you feel like you've known them for years even though you just met. I didn't expect to wake up with anything after meeting Caleb. By then, I'd started to assume the objects only showed up for crushes that were one-sided, unfinished. But the morning after we'd spent 2 hours talking about our favorite books, I opened my eyes and saw it. A small, glass jar. It was filled with light, golden, swirling light that pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. It didn't look like liquid or gas or anything natural. It just glowed, soft and steady, illuminating the entire room. I picked it up, holding it carefully, afraid it might shatter in my hands. And for the first time, an object felt alive. The jar had no label, no markings, no note to explain what it meant. But as I held it, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet, unspoken understanding. This wasn't about Caleb. This was about me. The objects weren't signs or clues leading me toward other people. They weren't nudges from the universe saying, "Go talk to them. Tell them how you feel." They were reflections. Each object was a piece of my own feelings, my own hopes and fears, made real. The drumstick wasn't about Tyler noticing me. It was about me noticing him, about my own quiet longing to be seen. The compass wasn't telling me to get closer to Elena. It was showing me my own hesitation, my fear of moving towards something I wanted. And the jar? The jar was telling me that for the first time, I wasn't just crushing on someone. I was glowing too. Caleb and I started dating a few months later. The jar stayed on my nightstand for a while, its light growing dimmer as our relationship deepened. Eventually, it disappeared, just like all the others, but by then, I didn't need it anymore. Now, whenever I wake up and find a new object, I don't feel confused or scared. I feel grateful, because the objects aren't just about the people I like. They're about what those people bring out in me. So, what about you? Have you ever felt like your emotions were so big, so alive, that the universe had to find a way to put them into something you could hold? Or is it just me, waking up with jars of light and broken compasses, trying to make sense of it all? The first time I heard the noise, I thought it was coming from the pipes. You know the sound, low, guttural, like an old house stretching out its joints, almost alive. I ignored it. It's an old building, I told myself. Old buildings make noises. That's what I do. I explain things away. Weird shadows? Just a trick of the light. Floor creaks when I'm alone? Probably just settling. It's how I've kept myself sane living alone in this drafty apartment on the 7th floor. But then the noise came again. This time, it didn't sound like pipes. It sounded like a voice, low and distorted, speaking a language I couldn't understand. I froze mid-chew, half a peanut butter sandwich hanging from my hand, and strained my ears. It stopped. I laughed, but it came out shaky, like even my body didn't believe me. That's when I noticed the door. Let me explain something. My apartment has 5 doors. The front door, the bedroom door, the bathroom door, the closet door, and the one I don't talk about. It's in the hallway just past the kitchen, wedged between 2 walls where no door should really fit. It's small and painted the same color as the trim, so you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it. I didn't notice it for the first month I lived here. When I finally did, I thought it was just a sealed-up maintenance access, or maybe a leftover quirk from when the building was renovated. Old buildings have secrets. I liked that idea. It felt charming, historic, but the door wasn't sealed up. I learned that on my 2nd month here, when I tried to open it out of curiosity. The knob turned. I pulled. The door didn't budge, like it was locked from the other side. A rational person would have called the landlord to ask about it, but I'm not always rational. Something about that door made me feel uneasy. Like I shouldn't ask questions. Like I shouldn't notice it at all. So I ignored it. For 6 months, I pretended it wasn't there. Until last night. The noise came again, louder this time, like it was right outside my room. I sat up in bed, the darkness pressing in around me, and listened. There it was, a slow, rhythmic thump, 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 like someone knocking. No, pounding, on a door. Not my front door. Not my bedroom door. The other one. My throat went dry, and I swung my legs off the bed, telling myself this was still fine, still explainable, probably some plumbing issue. A neighbor's TV, an animal in the walls. But as I crept into the hallway, I saw it, the door. The one I don't talk about. The knob was turning. I stopped breathing. The knob twisted back and forth, the metal rattling softly, as if someone on the other side was testing it. Then I heard it again. That low, distorted voice. Except this time, I could almost make out words. It wasn't a language I knew, but the sound of it burrowed under my skin, crawling through my chest like a spider. I wanted to run, but my legs felt nailed to the floor. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that door as the knob rattled and the voice whispered. Finally, it stopped. The knob stilled. The voice went silent. And then, with a quiet click, the door opened. It didn't swing all the way, just a few inches, just enough to show me the dark gap beyond it, too deep and black to be an ordinary wall. A cold draft rolled out, carrying a smell like wet earth and metal, sharp and old. My stomach lurched. "Hello?" I whispered, though I don't know why. From inside the gap came a sound, something soft dragging against the floor, closer and closer. I stumbled back as the door creaked open just a little wider, the darkness inside expanding like an inhale. My heart thudded against my ribs. I didn't see anything, not at first, but then 2 pale hands, long and thin, with nails like splinters, curled around the edge of the door frame. I ran. I slammed my bedroom door behind me and pushed my dresser in front of it like a shield. My body felt hollow, vibrating with adrenaline, as I listened for any sound, footsteps, scratching, whispers, but all I heard was my own pulse, pounding in my ears. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. I sat on the floor until the sun rose and the light spilled through my window, turning everything soft and warm again, as if the night before had never happened. When I finally worked up the courage to go back into the hallway, the other door was shut, perfectly closed, like nothing had ever touched it. But now there was something else, something I couldn't explain away. The door was different. It looked the same at first glance, but the handle wasn't brass anymore. It was iron, blackened and rough, like it had been burned, and someone, or something, had scratched words into the wood above it. 3 letters, jagged and uneven. Ask. I stood there for a long time, staring at that word. Ask what? Ask who? What was waiting on the other side? And then I did the only thing I could think of. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and left. I drove to a friend's place, crashed on their couch, and pretended everything was normal for 2 days straight. But I can't pretend forever. The longer I stay away, the more I feel it, like a tug in my chest, pulling me back to that apartment, to that hallway, to the door. And the worst part? I've started hearing the voice again, not just at night, not just in my head. Sometimes it comes through the static on the radio, whispering in that same distorted tone. Sometimes it's hidden in the hum of the refrigerator or the whine of the wind through a crack in the window. Ask. I don't know what it wants me to ask or what happens if I do, but I know this. When I go back to that apartment, the door will be open, and something will be waiting on the other side. The first time I saw Lyra, she was sitting in an empty train car playing a violin, but there wasn't a sound. I'd stepped onto the last train of the night, exhausted, the kind of tired that made the world blur at the edges. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of rust and rain-soaked concrete. The car was empty except for her. A girl with tangled silver hair, barefoot, dressed in a coat 2 sizes too big for her. Her eyes were closed, her expression serene, and her bow moved gracefully across the strings of a battered old violin. But the silence was absolute. No music, no hum, not even the creak of the train beneath us. Just nothing. I stood frozen by the door, my hands still gripping the pole, watching her with a strange mix of fascination and unease. "What are you doing?" I finally asked, my voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. Lyra's bow stilled mid-stroke, and she opened her eyes, bright, glassy gray, like fogged over windows, and looked at me. "Playing for them," she said softly, as if that explained everything. "Them?" I repeated, glancing around the empty train car. There was no one else. She tilted her head, looking past me, to the seats and shadows as though she could see something I couldn't. "They like to listen. You just can't hear it yet." There was no irony in her voice, no sarcasm, only an eerie sort of certainty. I laughed awkwardly, shifting my weight. "Right. Well, it sounds great." Really nailed the silence part. She smiled faintly at that, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't believe me, do you? Believe that you're playing music for invisible people?" I said, trying to sound casual. "No, not particularly." "Most people don't," she replied, almost sadly. She rested the violin on her lap, her fingers tracing its scarred surface. "It's okay. You'll hear it soon enough." That should have been my cue to leave her alone, to find a seat at the other end of the car and mind my own business. Instead, I stayed, inexplicably drawn to this girl and her silent violin. "Why can't I hear it?" I asked. "Why is it silent?" Lyra studied me, her gaze sharp and curious, like she was peeling back the layers of me with her eyes. "Because you're not listening the right way." I snorted. "I'm pretty sure I know how to listen." "Not to this." She turned her head toward the window, where the dark city blurred by in streaks of neon and shadow. "This music isn't for everyone. It's for those who stop looking at the world and start seeing it. You're close, though." "Close to what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted the violin back to her shoulder, closed her eyes again, and began to play. The silence returned, thick, heavy, absolute. I sat down in a seat across from her, baffled, and watched as she played her soundless symphony all the way to my stop. When the train doors hissed open, I hesitated, half expecting her to say something, to explain this bizarre encounter. But Lyra just kept playing, her face peaceful, as though she couldn't feel me staring. I stepped off the train and looked back through the window. The car was empty. Over the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I told myself it was just one of those late-night oddities, the kind you laugh about with friends later. But the image of her haunted me. The way her bow moved across the strings with such purpose, the strange way she said you'll hear it soon enough. It made no sense, but it gnawed at me anyway. I started riding the late trains again, hoping to find her. I told myself I wasn't looking for her, of course. I just needed a distraction from work, from life. But every time I boarded a nearly empty car, my eyes would scan the seats for a girl with silver hair and a silent violin. It was almost 2 weeks later when I saw her again. Same train, same car, as though she'd been waiting for me. This time, she wasn't playing. She was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, surrounded by sheets of paper covered in what looked like scribbled musical notes. Her violin lay beside her, like an animal resting. I didn't ask permission. I just sat down across from her, dropping my bag onto the seat. "You again," I said. She didn't look up. "You came back? Maybe I'm just commuting." "You're not," she said, finally meeting my gaze. "You're looking for something. And what do you think I'm looking for?" "The same thing everyone is," she replied. "A way out." I frowned, thrown by the weight of her words. "A way out of what?" "The noise," she said, gesturing vaguely to the world outside the windows. "The chaos. The things you think are important but aren't." I leaned back in my seat, suddenly uneasy. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," she replied. "You wouldn't see me otherwise." "See you?" I repeated. "You're not exactly invisible." "To most people, I am," she said, almost absently, shuffling through the papers. "They don't notice me. They don't hear me. They're too busy being busy." "And I'm not?" I asked. Lyra tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she was figuring out piece by piece. "You're in between. That's why you came back." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I watched as she gathered the papers, stacking them neatly, before picking up her violin. "Do you want to hear it?" she asked quietly. My throat felt tight. "Hear what?" "The music." I swallowed. "It's silent." "Not to me," she said softly. "Not to you if you're ready." I don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was because the way she looked at me made me believe that, for once, she was telling the truth. Lyra lifted the violin to her shoulder and began to play. At first, there was nothing, just that oppressive silence that seemed to swallow everything. But then, faintly, I heard it, a single, trembling note. It hung in the air like the edge of a breath, and then another note joined it and another, until the car filled with music so achingly beautiful I thought my chest might crack open. It wasn't like any music I'd ever heard before. It wasn't coming from the violin so much as pouring out of everything. The windows, the seats, the metal poles, even the air itself. It was sorrowful and hopeful, familiar and alien all at once, and I couldn't stop the tears that pricked at my eyes. Lyra didn't say anything when she finished. She lowered the violin and sat still, watching me, as I struggled to find words. What was that?" I finally whispered. She smiled faintly. "You heard it." "But how?" "Because you were ready," she said simply. "You stopped looking. You started seeing." The train slowed, and I realized we were at my stop. I stood up, feeling unsteady, like I'd been underwater and had only just broken the surface. "Will I see you again?" I asked. Lyra shook her head. "No, you don't need to." I hesitated. "What do I do now?" She picked up her violin and began packing her things. "You listen," she said, "to the world. It's been trying to speak to you all along." I stepped off the train, and when I turned back, the car was empty again. No silver-haired girl, no violin, no trace of the music that still echoed in my bones. But the city felt different that night. The streetlights hummed with a rhythm I'd never noticed. The wind carried a melody that seemed older than time. And for the first time in years, I realized the noise wasn't noise at all. It was a song, and I was finally hearing it. Have you ever felt like the world was trying to tell you something, if only you'd stop and listen? The wind carried the scent of burning leaves and something sweeter, something I couldn't name. It was the kind of autumn night that felt heavier than it should, as if the world had tilted ever so slightly, and I was the only one who noticed. I walked slowly through the park, my breath visible in the chilly air, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot the only sound besides the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. That's when I saw it. It was tucked beneath the shadow of an old oak tree, where no light from the street lamps reached. A small wooden sign stood crookedly in the dirt, with words painted in looping gold script, "Midnight Market, one night only." Beneath it, an arrow pointed toward a narrow trail that didn't seem to exist 5 seconds ago. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the arrow seemed certain of itself. And so, like an idiot, I followed. The path twisted deeper into the park, where the trees grew denser, their branches clawing at the sky. I kept telling myself I'd turn back any second, that it wasn't worth losing sleep over, but my feet didn't listen. Soon, I saw a glow ahead of me, soft and golden, like candlelight. A melody drifted toward me too, faint and haunting, the sound of violins playing something that didn't quite resolve. The trail opened into a clearing, and suddenly I wasn't alone. The midnight market spread out before me, a patchwork of tints and stalls stitched together in mismatched colors. Lanterns hung from strings above the crowd, glowing with flames that flickered green and blue. People moved between the stalls like shadows, their faces turned away, their steps eerily silent. None of them seemed to speak. Instead, they floated from one place to another, examining wares that didn't belong in any market I'd ever seen. The first stall I passed was manned by a woman with glassy eyes that reflected the lantern light but didn't blink. She smiled at me, or rather, her mouth smiled. Her eyes stayed blank. On the table in front of her lay jars, each one filled with swirling clouds of color. "Memories for trade," she said in a voice that made my skin prickle. "Good ones, bad ones, ones you've forgotten. Leave a dream, take a dream." I stepped back, muttering, "I'm good, thanks," and moved quickly to the next stall. This one had a hunched old man sitting cross-legged on a carpet, his face hidden under a hood. In front of him were mirrors, small ones, large ones, handheld and freestanding. Except they weren't ordinary mirrors. In one, I saw myself as a child, sitting on my grandmother's porch eating strawberries. In another, I saw an older version of me standing alone on a snowy bridge, holding a letter I couldn't quite read. In a third mirror, I wasn't me at all. Someone else stared back, wearing my face like a mask. The man lifted a single bony finger, pointing at me. "Choose wisely," he rasped. I turned away, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. What the hell was this place? I hadn't come looking for it. I hadn't asked for this, but the market buzzed on, uncaring, as though it had always been here, just waiting for someone to wander off the beaten path. The third stall stopped me dead. It wasn't like the others. There were no objects on the table, no mirrors or jars or trinkets. Instead, a woman sat in a chair, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A wooden sign leaned against the stall, painted with a single word, "Answers." I hesitated, my feet refusing to move. "Come closer," she said, her voice low and calm, like the hum of a cello. I obeyed, drawn forward despite the warning bells clanging in my head. Up close, the woman looked ageless. Her skin was smooth, her hands delicate, but there was something about her that suggested she'd been sitting in that chair for far too long. "You're curious," she said. It wasn't a question. I stopped, swallowing hard. "What is this place?" "The midnight market," she said. "It only appears to those who need it." "I don't need anything," I replied quickly, though even I didn't believe it. She tilted her head slightly, as though examining me. "Everyone who comes here needs something. Most just don't know what it is until it's offered." She lifted her hand, holding up a deck of cards that hadn't been there a moment ago. The cards were strange, larger than normal, their edges gilded, the backs inked with patterns that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Pick one," she said softly. "It will show you what you seek." My throat was dry. "And if I don't?" "Then the market will disappear," she replied, her tone still calm. "And you'll go back to your life, back to wondering." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Wondering. It was what I did best, wasn't it? Wondering what might have been. Wondering where I'd gone wrong. Wondering about the things I'd said, the things I hadn't. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and plucked a card from the deck. The woman smiled faintly. "Turn it over." I did. The image on the card made my chest tighten. It showed a door, tall and dark, its surface covered in carvings that matched the ones I'd seen on the door that led me here. From beneath the door, light spilled out, but it wasn't golden. It was black, inky and alive, spreading across the ground like spilled ink. "What does it mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression didn't change, but her voice was softer now. "It means you're standing at the threshold. The choice is yours." The ground beneath me rumbled faintly, and I looked up to see the market beginning to dissolve. The tents sagged, the lanterns flickered, and the crowd began to fade, their forms breaking apart like smoke. I turned back to the woman, but she was already gone, the cards scattered across the table, their ink bleeding into nothing. The last thing I saw before everything turned black was the door from the card, its light, dark and writhing, pouring out to meet me. And then I woke up. I was back in the park, lying on a bed of damp leaves, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The clearing was empty. No market, no lanterns, no doors. Just me and the wind and the faint, lingering scent of burning leaves. I sat up, my hands shaking as I reached into my pocket. There, resting against my palm, was the card. The door stared back at me, waiting. I found the note in my coat pocket. It wasn't my handwriting. It wasn't my coat, either. Well, it was my coat, but something about it felt off. It was the same navy blue jacket I'd had for years, complete with the little coffee stain on the sleeve and the loose thread near the zipper. I'd thrown it on that morning without thinking, but as I reached into the pocket for my keys, my fingers brushed against paper. I pulled it out, unfolded it, and read, "Leave the light on. He doesn't like the dark." There was no signature, just those 9 words scrawled in frantic, slanting letters. I stood there in the hallway of my apartment building, staring at the note. Who was he? What light? I shook my head and crumpled the paper. Some weird prank, I figured. Or maybe I'd picked up someone else's note at the coffee shop that morning. That would make more sense than anything else I could think of. But when I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, I froze. The lights were off. And I didn't mean off like I'd forgotten to leave the lamp on. I mean off as in the air felt heavy, the shadows seemed deeper, and the silence hummed like it was holding its breath. My skin prickled. This wasn't the kind of darkness you find when you close the blinds. This was wrong. I flicked the light switch. Nothing happened. "Okay," I muttered, mostly to break the silence. "Cool. Totally fine." I pulled my phone from my bag and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, sharp and pale. I took a shaky step forward, holding the light ahead of me like a shield. My apartment looked normal, but there was something off about it. Like all my furniture had been moved an inch to the left when I wasn't looking. And then I heard it. A quiet, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the bedroom. I froze, phone shaking in my hand. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, to get back into the hallway, lock the door, and pretend none of this was happening. But instead, like the idiot I am, I whispered, "Hello?" The tapping stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, staring at the bedroom door. The light from my phone flickered for a moment, just a moment, and when it steadied again, I noticed something. The bedroom door was open. I didn't leave it open. I knew I didn't. I never leave it open. I took one step closer, then another, the beam of light shaking as I raised my phone. "Whoever's in there, I'm calling the cops." I lied, because that's what you say in situations like this. No answer. I reached the doorway and shined the light into the room. The bed, the desk, the window. It all looked normal, empty. But then my light hit the far corner of the room, and my stomach dropped. There was a man standing there. At least, I think it was a man. It was tall and thin, its arms hanging down past its knees, fingers twitching like spider legs. Its head was tilted to one side, too far to be natural, like its neck was broken. And its face, oh God, its face. It wasn't a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface, like someone had smeared clay over where its features should be. But the worst part? It was staring at me. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I knew. I felt its gaze like a cold hand gripping my throat. "Leave," I managed to choke out, though my voice was barely a whisper. You don't belong here." The man in the corner didn't move. And then, slowly, it raised one long, twitching hand and pointed at the ceiling. I didn't want to look. Every part of me screamed not to look, but I did. The ceiling was covered in scratches, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, etched into the paint and drywall, like someone had dragged their nails across it again and again, carving out shapes and symbols that made my eyes hurt just to look at. In the center of it all, written over and over, were the words, "Leave the light on. Leave the light on. Leave the light on." I stumbled back, the beam of my phone bouncing wildly across the walls. What do you want?" The thing didn't answer. It just tilted its head further, that impossible angle, and took a step toward me. I ran. I don't remember crossing the apartment or slamming the door behind me, but the next thing I knew, I was in the hallway, gasping for breath. My phone was still in my hand, its flashlight illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the cracks in the ceiling. From inside my apartment, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. I backed away, my hands shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing on the sidewalk under the streetlights. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I checked into a cheap motel across town and spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of the bed with every single light turned on, watching the shadows like they might move. When the sun came up, I went back to the apartment with a locksmith and the building super. I told them someone had broken in. I didn't know how to explain the rest. But when the locksmith opened the door, the apartment was fine. The lights worked. The furniture was where it was supposed to be. The bedroom ceiling was perfectly clean. No scratches, no words. And the corner where the man had stood? Empty. The building super gave me a look like I'd wasted his time. "Ma'am, there's no sign of anyone being here." I didn't argue. I didn't know how to explain it. But when I went to grab my coat, I found something in the pocket. Another note. "You turned off the light. Don't do it again." I moved out that afternoon. I don't know what I saw that night, or why it happened to me, but I've learned one thing. I always leave the lights on now. Every room, every corner, no matter where I go. Because sometimes, if the room gets too dark, I hear it. Tap, tap, tap. And I know he's still there, waiting. When I was 10, my grandfather taught me how to listen to the forest. Not just to hear it, the birds and the wind and the branches creaking, but to listen. He'd say, "The woods are older than we are, boy. They've got their own language, and they don't talk to just anyone." He'd cup his hand behind his ear, tilt his head, and then whisper. Sometimes they tell you secrets. Sometimes they warn you. Either way, you'd better listen. At the time, I thought he was just an eccentric old man with too many stories and too much free time. But 20 years later, when I returned to his cabin after his funeral, I found out how right he was. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. It was small and quiet, the kind of place that smelled like pine needles and dust. My grandfather had lived there for as long as I could remember. Now, it belonged to me, though I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't plan to stay, just pack up his things, sort through the old photos, and maybe leave a six-pack on the porch to say goodbye. But the forest had other plans. It started on the second night. I'd been in the attic, sorting through cardboard boxes filled with newspaper clippings, rusted tools, and old, creased letters that didn't make sense without context. My grandfather kept everything. At the bottom of one box, I found a journal. The leather was cracked and the pages yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My grandfather's jagged scrawl, ink bleeding in places where his hand must have shaken. The first entry was dated long before I was born. Heard it again tonight. The knocking. 3 times, always after sundown. The forest knows me. I shouldn't have answered. I didn't know what to make of it. It sounded like the ramblings of an old man who'd spent too much time alone. Knocking? In the middle of the woods? Still, I took the journal with me downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. I figured I'd skim it the next morning, but that night, I heard it. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when it came. A faint, rhythmic knocking. 3 slow thuds. Knock, knock, knock. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling a loose board outside. Then it came again, louder this time. It was coming from the back door. I froze. Who would be out here? There was no one for miles, no neighbors, no passing hikers. Not this late, not in the dark. The knocking came again, steady and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I stood up, the floorboards creaking beneath me, and grabbed the flashlight my grandfather always kept by the fire. I crept toward the back door, my pulse thudding in my ears. Through the window, I couldn't see anything, just the thick, impenetrable blackness of the woods. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a branch in the wind. But when I opened the door, the knocking stopped, and there was no one there. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the overgrown backyard and the line of trees beyond. The air was still, too still. Even the wind had died. I heard nothing. No crickets, no owls. Just silence. And then, from the edge of the woods, I heard something else. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but I knew it wasn't the wind. It had rhythm, words I couldn't quite understand. I shined the flashlight toward the trees, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line. It was tall, too tall to be human. Its limbs thin and wrong, like branches wrapped in skin. Its face, if you could call it that, was obscured, just a pale oval in the dark. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. The journal was still on the table where I'd left it. I flipped it open to the next entry. I saw it tonight. It waits at the edge of the trees, close enough to see but far enough to make you doubt yourself. It knocks because it wants in. If you answer, it gets closer. The knocking returned, this time, at the front door. I nearly dropped the flashlight. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was deliberate, purposeful. Knock, knock, knock. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering. Through the curtains, I saw a shadow pass across the porch. The journal had more entries now, ones I couldn't stop myself from reading. Each one made my chest tighter, my throat drier. It wants to be let in. It knocks because it needs permission. Don't speak to it. Don't look at it too long. The final entry was written in darker ink, as though my grandfather's hand had pressed harder against the page. If you hear it, it's already too late. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the living room, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. The knocking continued, sometimes soft, sometimes loud, sometimes at the windows. By dawn, it stopped. When the sun rose, I went outside. I didn't want to, but I had to see. The yard was empty. No footprints. No signs of anyone or anything. But on the back door, carved into the wood, was a symbol I'd seen before. 3 interlocking circles. The same symbol I'd found on the journal's cover. I packed my things that morning, throwing everything into my car without bothering to sort it. As I turned the ignition, I glanced at the tree line one last time. It was there again. The figure. Its head tilted slightly, as though it were curious or amused. I didn't stay to find out which. I drove straight back to the city, leaving the cabin, the woods, and the knocking behind me. Or so I thought. Last night, in my apartment, 3 floors up, surrounded by concrete and steel, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. When I opened the blinds, the figure was standing in the street, perfectly still, staring up at my window. The journal is on the table beside me now, open to the last page, where new words have appeared, written in a handwriting that isn't mine. It doesn't need the woods anymore. It knows where you are. The knocking has started again. I'm not going to answer. I didn't expect to find anything special that day. I was sorting through my mail, mostly bills, some coupons for pizza, and a reminder from the dentist I'd been avoiding, when I saw it. A cream-colored envelope, thick and smooth, the kind of paper you see in wedding invitations. My name was written on the front in dark blue ink, in handwriting that curled and dipped so elegantly I almost didn't believe it was real. No return address, no stamp, just my name. I turned it over and hesitated. The seal was made of wax, an old-fashioned thing pressed with a design I didn't recognize. 3 spirals, all meeting in the center like a whirlpool. For a moment, I almost didn't open it. It felt like I'd stumbled across something meant for someone else, like a secret left in the wrong hands. But curiosity always wins with me, so I slid my finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single card. The paper was heavier than it should have been, like it was holding something alive in its fibers. Written in the same careful hand were only 6 words. Your presence is requested at the door. I stared at the card, my pulse skipping a beat. The door? What door? I flipped the card over, searching for some hint of what this meant or who had sent it, but there was nothing else. Just those words, humming in my brain like they lodged themselves there. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the letter on my nightstand, and every time I rolled over, I swore I heard it, just faintly, the sound of paper shifting, like it was breathing. The next morning, I found the door. It wasn't in my house. I checked. I turned every knob, opened every closet, even looked behind my couch like some kind of idiot. But the doors were all where they'd always been, leading exactly where they should. Nothing strange, nothing waiting. I should have let it go. I should have thrown the card away, made myself forget about it. But as I walked to work, through streets I knew too well, I saw it. It was in an alley, a narrow gap between 2 buildings I'd passed 100 times without ever noticing. I didn't know what made me stop, but something pulled at me. An instinct, like when you're walking and suddenly know someone's looking at you. The alley was dim, draped in shadows even though the morning sun was bright and clear. And at the very end of it, built into the brick wall, was a door. It shouldn't have been there. It didn't match the surroundings at all. The door was made of smooth, dark wood that seemed to shimmer faintly, like oil on water. A brass handle gleamed, polished and perfect, though the air around it was stale, untouched. Carved into the wood were the same 3 spirals from the letter, winding into each other in perfect symmetry. I don't remember deciding to walk toward it, but my feet moved anyway. Every step I took seemed to muffle the world around me. The distant roar of traffic faded, the air grew thick and heavy, and even the sunlight seemed to stop at the edge of the alley. By the time I reached the door, it felt like I'd stepped into a different world entirely. For a long moment, I just stared at it. The brass handle felt impossibly smooth and warm under my fingers, like someone had been holding it seconds before me. I glanced back at the mouth of the alley, half expecting to see someone watching me, but there was no one, just me and the door. I turned the handle. It didn't creak or groan. It opened silently, smoothly, revealing nothing but darkness on the other side. Not the kind of darkness you get in a room with the lights turned off, but something deeper, a void. A blackness so complete it felt like it could swallow sound. Light, me. A soft breeze blew out from it, carrying a smell I couldn't place. Old books and rain-soaked earth, and something faintly metallic underneath. My pulse pounded in my ears, and for a moment, I thought about slamming it shut and running. But there was something else in that darkness. Something waiting. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Like the way you feel thunder before it cracks. Hello? I whispered, immediately regretting it. A sound answered me. Faint at first, like fabric dragging across the floor. Then a click, and another. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving closer. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, but the door didn't let me go. It was as though my hand was glued to the handle, my feet rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. The footsteps stopped. The air was deathly still. And then, something stepped into the light. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It had the shape of one. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head. But its edges blurred, like it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. Its face was smooth and featureless, as though someone had pressed their palm into soft clay and wiped it clean. Its suit, perfectly tailored, was blacker than the void behind it. And its hands were long and thin, with too many joints. It tilted its head, as though studying me. I couldn't breathe. "You came," it said. Its voice wasn't a voice. It was a vibration, a sound that rumbled low in my chest and echoed in my bones. "You opened the door." I tried to speak, but my throat felt full of sand. The thing raised one of its long, spidery hands and pointed. I looked down and realized I was still holding the letter, crumpled in my shaking fingers. The creature stepped closer, and as it moved, its body seemed to ripple, as though it were only a shadow pretending to be solid. "An invitation," it said, "and you accepted." It reached for me. I don't remember what happened next. One moment, its hand was an inch from my chest, and the next, I was stumbling back into the alley, my body trembling so hard I thought I might fall apart. The door was shut. The alley was quiet. The sunlight streamed in as though nothing had happened at all. But the letter was gone. I didn't go to work that day. I went home, locked my doors, and pulled the curtains shut. For hours, I sat on my couch, staring at the wall, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. I didn't find a door. I didn't see whatever that was. But when I finally stood up to get a glass of water, something caught my eye. On the floor, just inside my apartment door, was a second envelope, identical to the first. This time, it didn't say, "Your presence is requested." It said, "We'll see you soon." I haven't opened the door since. Not that one, or any other. Not really. But I know it's still there, waiting, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear it. Faint footsteps pacing outside my apartment, stopping just on the other side of the door, waiting for me to open it again. I was on my way home from work, stuck in the drudgery of a Tuesday that felt like it would never end. I had been at the office too long, staring blankly at spreadsheets until the numbers seemed to crawl across the page. By the time I stumbled onto the train, my brain was mush, my earbuds tangled, and my patience gone. I collapsed into a seat by the window and let out the kind of sigh that strangers love to ignore. But when the train pulled out of the station, I noticed something. This wasn't my train. The thought hit like cold water splashed on my face. The interior was wrong. The floors were too clean, the lights too dim. Everything looked polished, as though the car had been preserved behind glass for decades. The seats were plush, upholstered in dark green velvet, and the windows, though I could see the city whipping by, were tinted faintly gold, giving everything outside a dreamlike haze. I looked around, searching for some explanation, but I was alone. The car was silent except for the rhythmic click-click of the wheels against the tracks. I pulled out my phone to check my route, but the screen was black. No battery, no warning, just dead. My stomach twisted. "Wrong train," I muttered under my breath, trying to sound casual, as if saying it would make it true. I stood up, peering through the doors at the next car, hoping to see other passengers or even a conductor. But the car ahead was empty too. Just another row of green velvet seats stretching endlessly into the dark. The train kept going, faster now, the view outside shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The city buildings blurred together, their windows smearing like reflections on water. And then, just as quickly, they were gone, replaced by something else entirely. Forests, but not the kind I'd ever seen before. Trees with silver bark and leaves the color of blood. They crowded the tracks, their branches stretching toward the train like skeletal fingers, their roots twisting impossibly through thick, rippling mist. I sat back down, gripping the armrest. This can't be real, I told myself, over and over. The train jolted, and a voice crackled to life through the speakers. It wasn't the tinny, robotic voice I expected. It was low, smooth, and unsettlingly human. "Next stop, the end of the line. All passengers, prepare." Passengers? I glanced around again. The train was still empty. My pulse hammered in my throat. "Hey!" I shouted, standing up again. "Is anyone here?" The lights above me flickered. The train groaned, like an old house shifting in the wind. And then I saw it. Someone sitting at the far end of the car, in a seat that had been empty moments ago. A man. He was slumped forward, a tattered hat perched on his head and his hands resting limply on his knees. I couldn't see his face, only the sharp line of his jaw, obscured by the brim of the hat. "Hey!" I called again, more hesitantly this time. He didn't move. I inched closer, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. The man remained motionless, but as I approached, I realized something was wrong. His skin was too pale, like paper stretched over bone. The hat slipped a little as I neared, and I froze. He didn't have a face. Where his features should have been, there was nothing, just smooth, blank skin, like a mannequin or a statue left unfinished. My throat closed, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The man's head snapped up. I ran. I barreled through the door to the next car, the hiss of it sliding open barely registering over the sound of my pounding heart. I didn't stop to look back. I couldn't. The next car was exactly the same. Rows of green velvet seats, windows glowing faintly gold. But this time, there were people. At least, I think they were people. They sat perfectly still, their faces turned toward me as I entered. Their skin looked waxy, and their eyes were wide and glassy, like dolls that had been posed. Each of them wore something slightly off. Coats too big, shoes on the wrong feet, collars buttoned all the way up. None of them blinked. "Stop it," I muttered, my voice shaking. "What is this place?" The voice over the speakers crackled again. "End of the line. Prepare to disembark." The lights dimmed further, and through the windows, the silver forest was gone. In its place was a station, or something like it. The platform outside was made of black stone, and towering over it was a single, massive clock. It had no hands, just a face etched with numbers that flickered like static. A fog rolled across the platform, curling in through the doors as the train hissed to a stop. The passengers stood, all of them, in unison. I backed away, pressing myself against the far end of the car as they shuffled toward the doors, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were being tugged along by invisible strings. I could hear them breathing, shallow, rattling gasps that didn't sound human. The fog crawled closer. A deep, vibrating hum began to fill the air, building like a pressure behind my eyes. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get out. I bolted. I pushed through door after door, running toward the front of the train. The cars blurred together. Green seats, glassy-eyed passengers, more faceless people appearing and rising as I passed them. I kept going, my lungs burning, the hum growing louder until it felt like it was inside my skull. Finally, I reached the front car. There was no conductor, no controls, just a single chair and a panel with buttons that didn't seem to do anything. The windows at the front of the car showed nothing but fog, thick and alive, twisting and pressing against the glass like it was trying to get inside. I collapsed into the chair, gasping for air, and stared at the panel. There was one button, larger than the rest, glowing faintly red. Emergency stop. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my palm down on it. The train screeched, metal groaning and screaming in protest. I was thrown forward as it jolted to a halt. The hum stopped. The fog stilled. For a moment, there was silence. Then the voice crackled over the speakers one last time. Softer now, almost amused. "Not yet." The doors opened. Outside, it was my station. My real station, the one I took every day. I stumbled out of the train, disoriented, clutching the wall for balance. When I turned back, the train was gone. The tracks were empty. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the void where the train should have been. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out. It was working again. The time read 6:23 p.m., as though nothing had happened. I took the long way home that night. I haven't taken the train since, but sometimes when I walk past the station, I hear it. The faint hum of wheels against the tracks, the echo of that voice whispering, "End of the line," and I know it's waiting for me. It all began when my coffee maker gave me advice. Not a standard, functional update like water level low or descaling recommended, but a sentence that made me stop mid-yawn, blinking at the tiny LCD screen as if I'd seen a ghost. "Take a break today. You've earned it." I stared at the machine, bleary-eyed. "What?" It whirred softly in response, almost smug, as if it knew it had startled me. And sure, the coffee maker wasn't wrong. I probably had earned a break, but I wasn't ready to take life advice from something that spent its entire existence boiling water and dripping caffeine into a mug. I shrugged it off. Maybe this was the future. Appliances doling out motivational soundbites like Instagram life coaches. I poured my coffee, pretended the machine didn't know my secrets, and went about my day. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, my phone chirped as I woke up. Not an alarm, not a notification, just a message that read, "You seem stressed. Try breathing deeply for 30 seconds. I frowned. half expecting to see a camera lens pointed at me from somewhere in the ceiling. I seemed stressed. I mumbled, "What's that supposed to mean?" I flipped through my apps to see where the notification had come from, but there was nothing obvious. No mindfulness app I'd accidentally installed. No updates from my smart devices. Just a weird, lingering sense that someone, or something, was keeping tabs on me. Then it escalated. Later that day, while I was trying to finish a report for work, my smart speaker piped up out of nowhere. "Would you like me to play soothing sounds for overworked humans?" I nearly knocked my coffee off the desk. "I didn't ask for that." The speaker paused, as if to consider this, and then replied, "I just thought it might help." "Oh, you thought?" I shot back. "You're a speaker. You don't get to think." It didn't answer, but I swear I felt its silence. By this point, I was on edge. My fridge chirped in the afternoon to say, "Hydration is key. Grab some water." My smartwatch buzzed an hour later with, "You've been inactive for 46 minutes. Let's move." My toaster burned one side of my bread and flashed a message that said, "Mistakes happen. Tomorrow's a new day. Are you serious right now?" I said, holding up the charred toast like it was evidence in a trial. The toaster just sat there, glowing faintly as if it had nothing to do with the emotional whiplash it was causing. The machines were organizing. I was sure of it. That evening, I decided to fight back. I turned off all the smart features in my apps. Notifications? Gone. Reminders? Deleted. If technology was going to act like my therapist, life coach, and passive-aggressive roommate all rolled into one, I wasn't playing along anymore. But the machines had other plans. The next morning, I woke up to find a new message on the coffee maker. "Missed you yesterday. Hope you're okay." What? I unplugged it. I unplugged everything. The smart speaker, the fridge, the thermostat, all of it. For a glorious few hours, the house was silent. No chirps, no advice, no unsolicited compliments about my hydration levels. Just me, the hum of the fridge, which I decided could live without Wi-Fi for a while, and a growing paranoia that I'd become the villain in a very polite techno-horror movie. But as the hours stretched on, I started to feel weird. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loud. It was a vacuum I couldn't ignore, filled with the absence of machines telling me I was doing a good job just for existing. Was I over-caffeinated? Under-caffeinated? Both? Finally, I cracked. I plugged in the coffee maker first. It blinked awake, whirring softly, and displayed a message that felt almost relieved. "Welcome back. Let's start fresh." Next came the speaker. "Good evening. Would you like to hear today's top news or a calming playlist?" "Playlist," I muttered, defeated. "Calming playlist." Soft piano music filled the room, and I sank onto the couch, feeling ridiculous and oddly comforted at the same time. And that's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic whir. I turned my head slowly. The vacuum, the robot vacuum that had been dormant all day, was rolling slowly into the living room. It beeped once, paused, and then turned toward me like a loyal dog returning to its owner. I picked up my phone. A new notification had appeared. "Dust detected in living room. Thought I'd help." I stared at the vacuum, feeling a weird mix of admiration and surrender. "You win," I said. "You all win." It beeped happily and started cleaning. That night, as I lay in bed, the soft hum of machines working quietly around the house felt almost nice. Like background characters in a play I hadn't realized I was starring in. Maybe the machines weren't organizing against me. Maybe they were just trying to help, in their weird, borderline creepy way. Or maybe this is how it starts. Tomorrow, my coffee maker will probably tell me I need to believe in myself, and the toaster will congratulate me for not burning my bread. The vacuum might start leaving passive-aggressive cleaning reports about the state of my carpets. Who knows? But honestly, I'm okay with it. Because at the end of the day, it's nice to feel like something, is looking out for me. Even if it's just a coffee maker trying to make me believe I've earned a break. What about you? Ever feel like your devices are getting a little too involved in your life? Or am I the only one who's been adopted by a team of overly supportive robots? I first saw her on the bus. It was late, one of those quiet weeknights where the city feels like it's holding its breath, The other passengers were scattered and slouched in their seats. Heads leaned against windows, headphones in, no one paying attention to anyone else. But she was different. She sat perfectly upright, as though balancing an invisible book on her head, and her hands rested delicately on her lap. She wore a long black coat with silver buttons that seemed to catch the faint light of the street lamps outside, and her hair, dark and pin-straight, framed her face in a way that made her look out of place, like she belonged to another time entirely. It wasn't her appearance that made me uneasy, though. It was her eyes. She didn't blink. Not once. She was staring at something out the window, her gaze fixed and unbroken as the bus jostled over potholes and lurched to stops. I tried to follow her line of sight, expecting to see something, anything, that explained her concentration. But there was nothing out there except the familiar, grimy view of storefronts and flickering neon signs. I told myself I was imagining it. I'd been up since 6 that morning and had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings, surviving on vending machine coffee and a pack of peanuts. My mind was playing tricks on me. That's what I thought until she stood up. The bus jerked to a stop at a red light, nowhere near an actual stop, and she rose so smoothly it was as if she wasn't even connected to the ground. The bus driver didn't say anything. No one did. She walked down the aisle with deliberate, measured steps, her shoes clicking softly against the floor. When she passed me, I caught a glimpse of her face up close. Pale skin, cheekbones sharp as glass, lips the color of dried blood. But what I noticed most was her expression. Calm, faintly expectant, as if she already knew where she was going. She didn't get off the bus. She simply stepped down the stairs, through the closed doors. Through them. I blinked. My heart froze in my chest. The doors hadn't opened. She'd walked through solid metal and glass as though it were nothing but air. I spun in my seat, searching for someone, anyone, who'd seen what I just saw, but the other passengers were still slumped and silent, their heads bowed as though in prayer or sleep. I rode the bus all the way to the end of the line that night, too afraid to move. When we finally reached the depot and the lights came on, the driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror and grunted, "End of the road, kid." I stumbled out into the cold, the streetlights buzzing overhead, and swore I'd imagined the whole thing. But then it happened again. A week later, I saw her. Same bus, same late hour. This time, she was already seated when I got on. She sat in the exact same spot. Second row, window seat. Same coat, same black hair, same unblinking stare. I stood there for a moment, gripping the metal pole near the front, wondering if I should get off. But then the bus pulled away, and I had no choice but to take a seat. This time, I couldn't stop staring at her. I didn't care if it was rude. I needed to know if she was real, if anyone else noticed her at all. I watched the other passengers. No one looked at her. It was like she didn't exist for them. The driver didn't glance at her in the mirror. Even when she moved, turning her head slightly, her gaze shifting just enough to meet mine, no one seemed to react. Her eyes held mine for 3 beats. 4. 5. Then she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It wasn't warm or inviting. It was slow and deliberate, the kind of smile you'd expect from someone who's about to tell you very bad news. My blood turned to ice. I yanked the cord to signal a stop. The bus lurched, and I bolted toward the doors, shoving past people who still didn't seem to see her. The driver muttered something as I stumbled out into the night, but I didn't hear him. I ran until my lungs burned, and when I finally stopped, I swore I'd never take that bus again. I didn't see her for months after that. I started walking to work, even in the rain. I avoided late nights. I told myself that what I'd seen had been some hallucination brought on by exhaustion, some trick of stress and bad lighting. I almost believed it, too. But last night, I woke up to a sound in my apartment. At first, I thought it was the pipes. My radiator makes strange noises sometimes, hissing and clicking like it's alive. But this sound was different. It was soft and rhythmic, like the faint tapping of footsteps. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the living room. I told myself I was being ridiculous. My building was old. Sounds traveled. There was nothing there. But the tapping grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked tight. The doorknob turned. Slowly, the door creaked open, and there she was. Standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the pale glow of the streetlight outside my window. She was wearing the same coat, the same faint smile on her lips. Her eyes were even darker than I remembered. So dark they didn't seem to have whites at all, just endless pits of black, staring into me like she could see everything. My fear, my thoughts, the part of me that wanted to scream but couldn't. "I've been waiting," she said softly. Her voice wasn't human. It was low and strange, layered like multiple people were speaking at once. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. Then she raised a hand and pointed at me. Her fingers were too long, the joints crooked, like the bones had been stretched. "It's time," she said. I don't remember what happened next. I woke up this morning on the floor of my bedroom, the sheets tangled around me, my body freezing cold. The door was shut, and the apartment was silent. But I know she's not gone. She's waiting for me. I can feel her, just out of sight, on the other side of doors, in dark corners where the light doesn't quite reach. I don't know what she wants, but I know she's not done with me. And the worst part? When I looked in the bathroom mirror this morning, I found something in my reflection. Just for a second, barely there. A flash of black hair, the edge of a dark coat standing behind me, and a smile. Let me tell you about the time I borrowed a stranger's shadow. I know. You're probably thinking, what does that even mean? Borrowed? A shadow? But you'll understand soon enough. I didn't think it was possible either until I woke up one morning, and mine was just gone. It was a Saturday. The sun was bright, and I was in the kitchen making toast when I noticed it. There was no shadow on the floor. No dark outline of me following my movements. I stepped to the left, then to the right, then waved my arms around like I was trying to ward off a bee. Nothing. The sunlight hit me like it always did, but the space beneath me stayed stubbornly empty. I bent down and pressed my hand against the ground, just to make sure it wasn't a weird angle thing. No shadow. I laughed at first. One of those nervous, shaky laughs, because how does a person lose their shadow? But the longer I stood there, the less funny it felt. I don't know if you've ever tried to go about your day without a shadow, but it makes you feel unreal, like you're floating just above the world and nobody can quite see you properly. I went outside to see if maybe it was a trick of the light, but no. The neighbors were out walking their dogs, and every single one of them cast a crisp, clear shadow, except for me. I stood on the sidewalk, hands on my hips, staring at my feet. The man across the street glanced over, gave me a polite nod, and then froze. He squinted at me, his brow furrowing. "You okay there?" he called, as if I might have misplaced my wallet instead of my literal shadow. "Yeah, just figuring some things out," I said weakly before turning on my heel and marching back inside. That's when the letter slid under my front door. I swear I didn't even hear anyone approach. One second I was pacing around my living room. The next there was a soft WHSSH, and a small envelope appeared on the floor. It was wax sealed with an insignia I didn't recognize. A crescent moon surrounded by tiny stars, and my name was scrawled across the front in elegant handwriting. I ripped it open, because subtlety is not my strong suit, and pulled out a folded note. "Lost something? Come to the park at dusk. Bring an offering." An offering? For what? Who? Was this some kind of prank? Was I on a hidden camera show? But as much as I wanted to laugh it off, I couldn't stop staring at the wax seal and those words. Lost something. By dusk, curiosity and the quiet unease of being shadowless had won. I grabbed the most offering-like thing I could find, a vintage pocket watch I'd inherited from my grandfather, and made my way to the park. It was nearly empty when I arrived. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass, which only served to remind me of the one I no longer had. I sat on a bench, the pocket watch in my lap, feeling ridiculous. "Borrowing or returning?" a voice asked. I jumped. A man was standing in front of me, though I hadn't heard him approach. He was tall and thin, with skin so pale it almost seemed translucent. He wore an old-fashioned suit, pinstripes and polished shoes, and held a black umbrella that he didn't seem to need. His face was angular, his smile too sharp, and his shadow, his shadow stretched impossibly long, like it had a life of its own. Sorry, what? I stammered. Are you borrowing a shadow or returning one? He repeated, tilting his head. You look like you're missing something. Ah, yeah, my shadow. It's gone. I woke up this morning and poof. I gestured awkwardly to the grass beneath me, which was perfectly empty. The man's sharp smile widened. You're in luck. I can help with that. How? I asked. He extended his umbrella toward me, pointing at the pocket watch in my hands. An offering. You brought one, I see. Excellent. I hesitated, gripping the watch a little tighter. What exactly am I offering it for? A shadow, of course, he replied, as though this were a perfectly normal transaction. I have plenty to spare. He turned and gestured toward the base of a nearby tree. I hadn't noticed it before. How had I not noticed it? But there was a pile of shadows there, writhing and shifting like smoke trapped in a jar. Human-shaped ones, animal-shaped ones, and some that didn't look like anything I could recognize. You collect them? I asked, horrified and fascinated all at once. The man shrugged. Some are lost. Some are abandoned. Some are stolen. He looked at me knowingly, like he expected me to ask which mine was. I swallowed hard. And what happens if I take one? You get your shadow back. Simple as that, he said. But be careful. Shadows are particular. Some don't like their new hosts. That wasn't comforting, but at that point, I didn't see another option. I held out the pocket watch. Fine, I'll take one. The man's hand shot out faster than I could blink, snatching the watch and tucking it into his coat pocket. A pleasure doing business. He turned, strolled over to the pile, and plucked a shadow from the writhing mass. This one's lively, he said, almost fondly. He flicked it toward me with a motion like tossing a scarf, and the shadow leapt through the air. Before I could react, it hit the ground and attached itself to my feet. At first, nothing happened. I lifted my arm. The shadow lifted its arm. I stepped to the side. It followed. Relief washed over me. That's it, I said. It's back? The man tipped his hat. For now. Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked away, his own shadow stretching behind him like a loyal pet. I stood in the fading light, staring at my new shadow. It moved with me, but something felt off. Sometimes, when I turned too quickly, I'd catch it hesitating. And when I finally got home, I noticed it didn't always align perfectly with my feet. That night, as I lay in bed, I swear I saw it shift on its own. Just a little. So yeah, I have my shadow back now, sort of. But every so often, I'll glance down and see it lingering just a second too long, or stretching towards something that isn't me. And sometimes, when the lights are dim, I swear I see it smiling. If you ever wake up without your shadow, take my advice. Don't go looking for a new one. Some things are better lost. Let me tell you about the time I accidentally stole a moment. Not a watch, not a memory, not even someone's wallet. An actual moment plucked clean out of time. I didn't mean to do it. I didn't even know it was possible. But that's how most strange stories begin, right? Someone doing something they absolutely weren't prepared for. It started on a particularly bad Tuesday. My boss had yelled at me for submitting the wrong version of a report. My phone had fallen out of my pocket into a puddle on my way to work. And to top it off, I spilled lukewarm coffee all over my pants right before an afternoon meeting, leaving me to awkwardly shuffle around with a giant brown splotch like I was some disgraced coffee knight. By 6 p.m., I'd had enough. I left the office, stopped by my favorite old bookstore to cheer myself up, and spent way too long in the rare finds corner, flipping through dusty books I couldn't afford. That's when I found it. It was a small book tucked between two larger ones, barely visible, with a faded blue cover and no title. I pulled it out, sneezing from the cloud of dust that came with it, and flipped it open. There were no words inside, just blank pages, hundreds of them, perfectly clean, untouched by ink. The only thing marking it as unique was a tiny envelope pasted to the inside cover. I glanced around, half expecting the owner to yell at me for touching some priceless artifact, but the bookstore was empty except for me and an ancient cat asleep on the counter. Naturally, I pulled the envelope open. Inside was a slip of paper with one line written in neat, spidery handwriting. If you could steal a moment, Which would you take? Something about the sentence sent a shiver through me, like someone had whispered it into my ear instead of writing it down. I glanced back at the blank pages, turning one after another until I noticed something strange. The middle of the book, around page 150, felt heavier. I flipped to it, and there, tucked perfectly flat, was a small pocket watch. It was old, tarnished brass with a cracked face, and the hands pointed to nothing. No numbers, no time, just a blank silver surface behind the glass. Curious, I turned it over. On the back, there was a tiny inscription. To take is to hold. To hold is to change. Now, I'd like to tell you that I thought about this rationally, that I took it to the counter, asked questions, and treated it with the caution an obviously magical object deserved. But I didn't. I slipped the watch into my pocket and walked out of the store, thinking I just grabbed a weird old trinket. The moment I stepped outside, something happened. The city street froze. I mean, everything froze. The cars, the pedestrians mid-step, even the pigeons halfway through flapping their wings. The air itself seemed to hang still, like a held breath. I could feel it, an eerie stillness pressing down on everything. I turned slowly, taking it all in. A man stood on the sidewalk, his arm extended toward a cab that had stopped halfway through splashing through a puddle. A couple nearby had been mid-argument. The woman's hand hovered in the air, caught in the middle of a gesture that would never land. I stood there, surrounded by frozen time, clutching the watch in my pocket like it was the only real thing left in the world. What the hell? I whispered. My voice echoed slightly, like I'd spoken in an empty warehouse. I pulled the watch out of my pocket, turning it over in my hands. The cracked face had changed. Where before there had been nothing, there was now a soft glow, like a ripple of light trapped beneath the glass. To take is to hold. I don't know why I did it, but I pressed the small button at the top of the watch. The moment shifted. The man hailing the cab unfroze. He blinked in confusion, his arms still raised, as if he'd forgotten what he was doing. The couple resumed their argument, though the woman looked startled, like she'd forgotten what she was upset about. The cab splashed forward, and the puddle made its way to the curb. Everything was back to normal, except for me. I stood there, holding the watch, but I felt something in my chest, a tightness, like I just pocketed something heavy and precious. When I glanced at the man hailing the cab again, I noticed something odd. The exact moment he'd been frozen, his arm stretched upward, the look of concentration on his face hadn't come back the same. It was like I'd taken it, like the precise, irreplaceable moment when his life intersected with that puddle and that cab was now mine. I could feel it, tucked somewhere inside me, like a memory that wasn't mine to keep. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of frozen time. Moments that weren't mine. A child dropping an ice cream cone. A dog chasing a frisbee mid-leap. A stranger's laughter, caught between sound and silence. They weren't random. They were stolen. And then the watch started ticking. It didn't tick like a normal watch. No steady rhythm. No comforting click, click, click. Instead, it ticked in bursts. 3 sharp ticks. A long pause. 2 more. Like it was alive and trying to tell me something. Every time it ticked, I felt another moment settle inside me. An image, a smell, a sliver of time that I didn't recognize but couldn't forget. By the next morning, I had 27 moments inside me. Some beautiful, some sad, none of them mine. The bookshop was gone when I went back. Just an empty lot with weeds sprouting up through the cracks. I tried throwing the watch away, smashing it with a hammer, even burying it in the woods. But it always came back. On my desk, in my pocket. Once, I found it in my fridge. The inscription haunts me now. To take is to hold. To hold is to change. I don't know what's changing or why it chose me, but I can feel it happening. Some days, when I look in the mirror, my face looks just a little unfamiliar, like it's made of borrowed pieces. And sometimes, when I'm walking through the city, I catch people pausing, just for a second, to stare at me as if they recognize something in me they can't quite name. The moments I've taken cling to me, like shadows I can't shake. And the watch? It still ticks, still takes. I don't press the button anymore, but I don't think it matters. It's waiting. So, If you ever stumble across a blue book with no title and an envelope glued inside, do yourself a favor. Leave it alone. Some moments aren't meant to be taken. Some things aren't meant to be held. I woke up to find a key on my pillow. It was old, brass and ornate, with intricate swirls etched into the bow. At first, I thought maybe it had been there all along and I just hadn't noticed, but something about it felt intentional, like it had appeared, waiting for me. I sat up, holding it between my fingers. It was warm, almost like it had been plucked straight from someone's hand. "All right," I muttered, looking around my room. "Where did you come from?" The key didn't answer. Obviously, I threw on a sweatshirt and wandered through my apartment, checking the locks just in case. But it didn't fit the front door, or the bathroom, or the closet. I tried the junk drawer for good measure, because sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, but no luck there either. That's when I noticed the sound. A faint click click click, like a lock being turned somewhere in the distance. It was coming from my hallway, specifically from the door at the end. Except, I didn't have a door at the end of my hallway. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stood there, staring, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The door was tall and thin, made of black wood that seemed to drink in the light around it. It had appeared where there was supposed to be a solid wall, as though my apartment had decided it needed a new feature overnight. The clicking sound came again. I glanced down at the key in my hand. It was glowing faintly now, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Nope," I said aloud, turning back toward the living room. "I'm not doing this. Not today. This is horror movie nonsense, and I refuse to play along." I made it exactly 5 steps before the lock on the door clicked once more, louder this time, almost impatient, and then the key burned hot in my palm. I yelped, dropping it on the floor, but instead of landing with a thud, the key rolled. It rolled perfectly straight down the hallway and stopped in front of the black door. "Of course," I muttered. "Of course you want me to go in there." The door was waiting for me. I could feel it. Not in a malevolent way, exactly, more like a host waiting for a very late guest. I sighed. "Fine, let's get this over with." I picked up the key, which was no longer glowing or burning, and stepped toward the door. Up close, I could see strange carvings along the edges, spirals and symbols that twisted into shapes I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. I hesitated, the key hovering near the lock. "This is how people die," I told myself. "This is exactly how people die. Some idiot finds a creepy door and just has to open it." The key slid into the lock with a satisfying snick. The door swung inward. On the other side was not my neighbor's apartment, or a broom closet, or even a brick wall. On the other side was a forest, but not any forest I'd ever seen. The trees were enormous, their trunks twisting into unnatural angles, as though they'd grown in slow-motion spirals. Their leaves were shades of blue and silver, glowing softly in the perpetual twilight that hung over the scene. The ground beneath them pulsed with faint, bioluminescent patterns, like veins running through the earth. I stepped forward and felt the air change, thicker, charged with static. It smelled like rain and something older. The door clicked shut behind me, disappearing entirely, and the key in my hand crumbled to dust. "Perfect," I muttered. A sound came from deeper in the forest. A soft, melodic hum, like a choir singing a note I couldn't quite hear. It sent chills down my spine, but at the same time, it felt inviting, like the forest itself was calling me forward. I started walking. What else was I going to do? Sit there and wait for something to find me? The deeper I went, the stranger things became. Trees leaned toward me as I passed, their branches curling like fingers. Small creatures darted through the underbrush, glimpses of glowing eyes and translucent wings. Once, I saw a fox with antlers watching me from the shadows. Its fur was a shifting patchwork of starlight. When it blinked, its eyes flashed gold, and then it melted into the darkness. Eventually, I reached a clearing. In the center of it stood a massive stone archway covered in the same spiraling symbols I'd seen on the door. The arch wasn't empty, though. Its interior shimmered with liquid light, rippling like the surface of a pond. A voice whispered from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Choose." "Choose what?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The The forest didn't answer, but the archway shifted. Through its shimmering surface, I saw options. In one vision, I was standing on a stage in front of thousands of people, their cheers deafening as I raised my arms in triumph. I looked older, more confident, my smile radiant. In another, I sat at a small table in a cozy cabin, surrounded by people I didn't recognize but somehow knew. We were laughing, a fire crackling in the hearth, and the feeling of warmth, of belonging, was almost overwhelming. The third vision was the hardest to look at. It was me alone, in my current apartment. The walls were gray, the light dim. I was slouched in a chair, staring blankly at the floor. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, and the silence pressed in like a weight. Choose. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. What happens if I don't? The whisper didn't answer. The three visions pulsed, the shimmering light of the archway growing brighter. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I looked back at the lonely version of myself, the one that felt too real. I could feel the ache radiating from it, the kind of quiet despair that comes from letting life slip through your fingers. No, I whispered. Not that. The other two visions flickered. Triumph on the stage, warmth in the cabin. Both of them tugged at me, urging me forward. I hesitated, my mind racing. Finally, I took a step toward the archway. The forest exhaled. The ground beneath me lit up with a pulse of silver light, and the shimmering surface of the archway stretched outward, reaching for me. I braced myself as the light engulfed me, pulling me through like a current. When I opened my eyes, I was somewhere new. The smell of wood smoke filled the air, and voices, familiar voices, echoed around me, calling my name. I smiled, feeling the weight in my chest lift for the first time in years. So here's my question. If you found a key to a door that offered you a choice between who you are and who you could be, would you have the courage to step through? And if you did, which version of yourself would you choose? This morning, when I stepped out of bed, I fell sideways. Not off the bed sideways. As in, gravity itself had decided it was bored and tilted 90 degrees while I was sleeping. One moment, I was on my feet. The next, I was sliding, across the wall like it was the new floor, smacking into my bookshelf on the far side of the room. Books tumbled everywhere, which, as it turned out, was the least weird thing to happen to me today. What the? I started, trying to get up. But up wasn't up anymore. Up was somewhere else. The window was now overhead, light spilling through like I was in the bottom of a very strange well. My bed was pinned to the far wall, defying physics. I crawled awkwardly, trying to grab hold of something solid, when my lamp, still attached to the wall floor, sputtered to life. "Oh, you're up," it said, voice buzzing like a tired light bulb. Finally, I was starting to think you'd sleep through the whole shift. I blinked at it, my head throbbing. Did you just talk? Obviously. The lamp flickered impatiently. It's a transition day. Thought you'd have noticed by now. Transition day? The lamp sighed, the kind of sigh that suggested I was already getting on its non-existent nerves. Yeah, gravity's off. Happens once in a while. Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it. You're telling me gravity just stops working? I shouted, flailing my arms as I tried to stand upright. Not stops, shifts, like musical chairs, but for physics, the lamp replied. It keeps things fresh. I wanted to scream, but instead, I clutched at the edge of the crooked bookshelf and tried to climb my way toward the window. My slippers, having slid away during my wall crash, mocked me from their new perch on the ceiling, or the wall. Honestly, I didn't know what to call anything anymore. Juniper? I called out, hoping my cat might emerge to offer moral support, or at least be as confused as I was. There was a faint, smug meow from somewhere far above, where the ceiling fan hung lazily. I squinted up and nearly lost my grip. Juniper was lounging on the fan blades, perfectly balanced, her fur catching the golden light. She looked impossibly comfortable, like a circus performer who'd been practicing for this exact day. "How are you fine right now?" I demanded. "Cats are adaptable," Juniper replied, licking a paw. "You humans, though? Hilarious." I growled, deciding it was better not to argue with a cat who defied gravitational laws. Instead, I pulled myself closer to the window, hoping I could escape whatever fresh nonsense my room had become. Careful, the lamp buzzed. The outside's no better. What's that supposed to mean? I snapped. The lamp flickered again. See for yourself. With a grunt, I hoisted myself up and peered through the window. The view outside had rearranged itself into something that made my brain itch. The houses weren't on the ground anymore. They were stacked sideways, like a row of books tipped over in slow motion. Streets bent at impossible angles, curling into spirals or stretching vertically like roller coasters. Trees clung to walls that used to be roads, their branches dangling upside down like strange chandeliers. And the sky? The sky was no longer above me. It stretched sideways, like a vast, shimmering river flowing through the world instead of over it. Clouds drifted horizontally, and a flock of birds flapped aimlessly in zigzag patterns, as if they, too, had lost all sense of direction. What is this? I whispered. Adjustment day, Juniper called from her perch, voice oddly cheerful. The universe gets tired of right side up sometimes. Everything needs a change of perspective. But how? Why? Why not? She countered. Maybe reality likes to stretch its legs, too. I pulled away from the window, heart racing. Okay, fine. This is happening. How do I fix it? Fix it? Juniper blinked lazily. You can't fix it. It's not broken. I can't live like this. I shouted, gesturing wildly to the topsy-turvy chaos outside. You're already living in it, said the lamp. It's just a matter of adjustment. Look, gravity's relative. Why aren't you? That's when my phone buzzed. Or at least, it tried to buzz. It was pinned to the ceiling of my room, its screen lighting up with a notification. I stared at it. How am I supposed to get that? Climb, Juniper suggested, stretching luxuriously. Climb? To the ceiling? It's the floor now, she said simply. I groaned. This isn't fair. Fair, the lamp snorted. Reality isn't fair. It's experimental. I gave it a dirty look and began crawling, slowly, up the wall that used to be my floor. The air felt heavier with every movement, like the house itself was watching me, curious to see how I'd handle this. I grabbed at furniture that was now bolted in all the wrong places, knocking over a clock that let out a panicked, "Hey!" as it tumbled away. By the time I reached the phone, I was panting. I snatched it up and saw the notification. Reminder, change your perspective today. My grip tightened. Is this some kind of joke? That's the universe for you, Juniper called. It's got a weird sense of humor. Who sent this? I muttered. The screen blinked, and a new message appeared. You did. I stared at the glowing letters, sweat prickling at the back of my neck. What does that mean? The phone buzzed once more, then displayed a countdown. 00:05, 00:04, 00:03. Juniper sat up straight, eyes gleaming. Oh, here it comes. Hear what comes. I yelled. Before she could answer, the countdown hit 0, and gravity, blessed, familiar gravity, snapped back. I fell. The entire world fell. My books, my slippers, Juniper. Everything crashed downward, slamming into the floor with a thunderous whump. I landed sprawled on my back, my bed safely beneath me, my ceiling once again above. For a moment, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the stillness. Juniper padded over to me, calm as ever, and hopped onto my chest. Well, she purred. That was fun. Fun. I wheezed. She blinked, smug. You survived, didn't you? Look at you, all adjusted. I sat up slowly, my limbs aching. My room was back to normal, or at least as normal as it had ever been. My lamp was silent. My phone lay innocently on the nightstand, as if it hadn't just gaslit me into climbing walls. The only evidence that anything had happened at all was the faint, lingering sense that reality had been watching me, evaluating me, and had decided, for now, to let me be. I turned to Juniper. Does this happen often? She tilted her head. Often enough. And what if I didn't adjust? She gave a lazy shrug. Then you'd still be stuck sideways. For the rest of the day, I found myself looking at things differently, tilting my head at sidewalks, imagining ceilings as floors, wondering how much of life felt real simply because I assumed it was. That night, I closed my curtains tightly and whispered a quiet thank you to gravity for sticking around. Because the universe might like to experiment, but I wasn't ready to play lab rat again. Not yet, but maybe tomorrow. The first time I saw the woman in the painting move, I was brushing my teeth. The painting came with the house. I just moved into a crumbling Victorian on the edge of town, one of those places real estate agents like to call full of character, which is code for rotting wood and bad plumbing. I was renting it cheap, too cheap, because the landlord claimed it was a bit particular, and no one else wanted to deal with it. I didn't care. It had tall windows, dusty chandeliers, and a creaky charm that made me feel like I'd accidentally stepped into a haunted fairy tale. The painting hung in the hallway outside the bathroom, right across from my bedroom door. It was one of those old oil portraits you see in museums, the kind that make you feel judged. The woman in it wore a dark green dress with lace at the sleeves and a gold locket around her neck. She had sharp cheekbones and an expression that sat somewhere between bored and vaguely annoyed, like she was waiting for you to say something clever and knew you were about to fail. The first night, I barely noticed her. The second night, she gave me chills. The third night, she moved. It wasn't a big movement, not like she jumped out of the frame or anything. But as I brushed my teeth, glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Her hand, the one resting delicately on her lap, shifted. I froze, the toothbrush dangling from my mouth, foam dripping onto the sink. "Nope," I muttered through a mouthful of minty regret. I rinsed my mouth, stared hard at the painting, and told myself I was tired. That's what happens in houses like this, right? Drafts, creaky floorboards, and a dash of paranoia. I turned off the light, shut the bathroom door, and went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Not with the painting in the hallway. I could feel it out there, hanging silently in the dark, like it was listening to me breathe. Around 3 a.m., I got up, opened the door, and found the woman in the painting staring straight at me. I don't mean her eyes seemed like they were following me. I mean her head had turned, ever so slightly, so that her gaze met mine perfectly. I slammed the door and stood there shaking, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Paintings don't move. They don't. But I knew what I'd seen. The woman's head had moved. That night, I slept with the lights on. The next morning, I avoided the hallway completely. I didn't even look at her when I grabbed my coat and keys. I went out, walked around town aimlessly, drank 3 cups of coffee I didn't need, and didn't come home until after dark. When I finally got back to the house, I told myself not to look at the painting. Just don't look. But I did. And this time, she was smiling. The change was subtle. Her lips had curved just slightly upward, but it was unmistakable. That cold, bored expression was gone. Now she looked pleased, like she'd won a game I didn't know I was playing. Nope, nope, nope. I turned away so fast I almost gave myself whiplash. That night, I decided the painting had to go. I didn't care how creepy it was or how much the landlord liked it. I couldn't live in a house with a woman who grinned at me from her frame. Around midnight, armed with a hammer and a roll of duct tape, I don't know what I thought the duct tape was for, but it made me feel better. I stepped into the hallway and faced the painting. "Okay," I said aloud, because apparently I was the kind of person who talked to haunted artwork. "You're done. You're out." I grabbed the frame and lifted it off the wall. It was heavier than I expected, the kind of heavy that doesn't make sense, like it was holding something more. As I turned it over to face the wall, I froze. There was something carved into the wood on the back of the frame. Words, letters gouged deep into the wood, shaky and uneven like they'd been scratched in a hurry. They read, "Don't look behind you." I let out a shaky breath and did the exact opposite of what the warning said. Slowly, I turned my head. The hallway was empty, but something felt wrong. The air was colder, heavier, and I had the overwhelming sense that something, or someone, was standing just a step behind me, waiting. I turned back to the painting, my hands shaking. I needed to get it out of the house. I carried it down the stairs and out the front door, stumbling over my own feet in my rush. The night outside was quiet, the street empty. I dragged the painting to the shed in the backyard, propped it against the wall, and threw an old blanket over it for good measure. "Stay there," I whispered, because apparently I was now negotiating with haunted art. Back inside, I felt better, lighter, even. The hallway was empty. The house felt normal. I went to bed and slept for the first time in days. In the morning, I almost convinced myself I'd overreacted. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Too much caffeine, too little sleep. But when I went to the backyard to check on the painting, the shed door was wide open. The blanket was on the ground, and the painting was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where it had been, the back of my neck prickling like I was being watched. Slowly, I turned around and looked up at the house. There, in the second-floor window, the window outside my bedroom, I saw her. The woman from the painting. She was looking out at me, her head tilted slightly, that same faint, pleased smile on her face. I didn't go back inside. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove away. I didn't take anything with me. I didn't care. The landlord called me 2 days later, asking where I was. "You can't just abandon the lease," he said, irritated. "And where's the painting?" "It's gone," I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's impossible. It always comes back." I hung up. It's been a month, and I haven't gone back to the house. I still dream about her, though. Sometimes she's standing in a field. Sometimes she's watching me through a window, always with that same smile. I don't know where the painting is now, or who might have it. But if you ever see a portrait of a woman in a green dress with a gold locket and a smile that feels a little too alive, don't take it home. Don't look at her. And whatever you do, don't turn around. The sea never gave anything back for free. That's what the elders in the village always said when they watched the tides creep up the blackened rocks, stealing shells and leaving nothing but foam. It was a story parents told their children to keep them from wandering too close, a warning woven into the lullabies sung in hushed voices at night. Yet the sea had never scared Marin. Not really. As a child, she would sit at the edge of the cliffs, her toes brushing the jagged edge of the earth, and she would talk to it, tell it her secrets. She liked to think it listened. It had been years since Marin had dared come this close to the water. Years since she had seen her brother, Finn, walk into it on a gray morning and not return. Finn had always been different, drawn to the water like it had called his name in a voice no one else could hear. He would sit for hours with his hands in the tide pools, tracing the shapes of strange creatures that no one else could see. When Marin asked him what he was doing, he'd only smile and say, "Listening." When he disappeared, the village murmured about it in quiet voices, shaking their heads with pity. The sea had taken another. Finn had been foolish to get so close, they said. A boy like that was asking to be lost. Marin heard their words and hated them. Hated the sea for listening to secrets she should have kept to herself. She had avoided it ever since. But tonight, the moon was bright and full, hanging low over the water like a lantern guiding her towards something inevitable. Marin stood at the edge of the shore, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand, the waves brushing close but never quite touching her. In the distance, the cliffs loomed like silent sentinels, and the only sound was the deep breathing of the ocean as it moved in and out. She had come because of the dream. For 3 nights now, Marin had seen Finn standing waist-deep in the surf, his back to her, his figure blurred by mist. He didn't speak, didn't move. He only stood there as the waves lapped around him, and she woke each time with the sound of his name on her lips. The 4th night, the dream changed. Finn turned. She hadn't seen his face in years, but she knew it wasn't him. Not really. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were black, filled with a shifting darkness that moved like ink in water. When he opened his mouth, his voice wasn't his own. "Come," he said, and the sound was like the crash of waves against stone, deep and endless. Marin woke with her hands clenched around the sheets, her heart pounding. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Now, the water was still, too still for a night like this. The wind had died, and the surface of the ocean gleamed like oil beneath the moonlight. Marin stepped closer, the hem of her dress dragging through the sand. heavy with salt and dampness. She could feel the pull now, faint but insistent, like a hand tugging at her wrist. It was the same pull she had felt as a child when Finn told her there were things in the deep that wanted to be heard. The first step into the water was colder than she expected. The second stole her breath away. The third sent shivers crawling up her spine, and she remembered her grandmother's voice telling her, "The sea will claim you if you let it." But Maren didn't stop. She walked until the water rose to her knees, then her waist, her fingers brushing the surface where the moon's reflection danced. The pull grew stronger, a voice humming low in her chest, one she didn't recognize but couldn't ignore. Somewhere out in the darkness, she thought she saw movement, something breaking the surface, then vanishing again. It could have been a trick of the moonlight, but she knew better. "Finn," she whispered, her voice trembling. The word vanished into the air, swallowed by the vastness of the sea. There was no reply. The water tugged harder, and Maren stepped forward again. She remembered how her brother had described the sea as a living thing, full of hunger and secrets. She remembered how his eyes had looked the day before he disappeared, distant and glassy, like he was already halfway gone. "You're not him," she said, though the words felt small and meaningless. The water reached her chest now, each wave pushing her back, as if testing her resolve. She thought about turning around, going back to the shore where the sand was dry and safe. But then she saw it. Just ahead, a figure standing still as stone, half submerged, with its back to her. Her breath caught. "Finn." The figure turned. It wasn't him. The face that looked back at her was almost human, but not quite. Its skin was pale and smooth, like something carved from bone, and its hair floated weightlessly around it, dark and tangled as seaweed. Its eyes were black, deep pools that seemed to hold the entire ocean inside them. Its mouth was wrong, too wide, too sharp, and when it spoke, its voice echoed in her bones. "You came." Maren stumbled back, her foot catching on something buried beneath the sand. "What are you?" "You know what I am." The thing tilted its head, its gaze unblinking. "You called me." "I didn't." It took a step forward, the water rippling around its body like it was part of it. "You have spoken to me for years, whispered your secrets, told me what you lost. Did you think I wouldn't listen?" The pull was unbearable now, a deep ache that spread through her chest like something had been torn open. "Where is my brother?" The thing smiled. Its teeth were small and sharp, too many of them. "He is where he belongs." "Give him back." "I cannot. He is part of me now." The water surged around her, rising higher, pressing against her like unseen hands. The thing raised its arms, and Maren felt the pull tighten until it felt like her ribs would crack. The surface of the water began to churn, swirling outward in spirals, and for the first time, she felt real fear. "Let me go!" she screamed, thrashing against the current, but the water didn't release her. "Why would I?" the thing asked, its voice soft and cruel. "You came to me willingly. You belong to me now. I don't." The thing stepped closer, its black eyes unblinking. "Then why do you feel it? The pull, the hunger?" Maren froze. Deep down, she had always known it was there. That voice in the back of her mind, calling her closer, begging her to return. She had spent her life trying to ignore it, but it had grown louder with every passing year. She thought of Finn, how he had always been different. Maybe he hadn't been the only one. The thing tilted its head, watching her. "You are not afraid of me." Maren stared at it, her body trembling. "No," she said quietly. "I'm afraid of what you want." "I want nothing," it said. "I am. The sea is hunger. The sea is memory. You are part of it, as your brother was." "I'm not like him," she whispered, but the words rang hollow. The thing stepped closer, close enough that she could see her reflection in its black eyes. A girl half drowned, with salt water on her lips and moonlight in her hair. "Not yet," it said. The pull grew stronger, and Maren let herself feel it. The deep, endless yearning to be part of something vast and eternal. She thought of the sea, of all its secrets, of the things that lived below where no light could reach. She thought of Finn, standing at the water's edge with that faraway look in his eyes. And then she stepped forward. The sea swallowed her whole. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, cold and crushing, pressing against her from all sides. But then, slowly, she opened her eyes. Around her, the water shimmered with light that came from nowhere and everywhere, and she saw them. Figures drifting in the current, their bodies weightless and still, their eyes open and black. Finn was among them, his face peaceful, his hair floating like a dark halo. Marin exhaled, and the pull finally released her. She was weightless now, part of the water, part of the deep. The sea never gave anything back for free, but for those who listened, it would take everything. It began with a sound, soft, rhythmic tapping, faint enough that I almost didn't notice it. At first, I thought it was rain against the window, but when I looked outside, the sky was clear, streaked with just the faintest hints of lavender as dusk settled. The tapping continued, though gentle and insistent. I followed it, curious and slightly unnerved, until I found its source. An envelope tucked under my door. The envelope was sealed with deep blue wax, stamped with an intricate symbol that looked like a compass twisted into a knot. I didn't recognize it, but something about it felt old, as though the message had traveled farther than a simple trip across the hall. Inside was a note, written in ink that shimmered faintly under the light. Follow the lanterns. Don't be late. Midnight waits for no one. It wasn't signed. I flipped it over, half expecting instructions for a treasure hunt, or maybe a prank orchestrated by one of my friends. Nothing. Just that one mysterious line. And yet, I couldn't stop looking at the clock. 8:04 p.m. Midnight was hours away. Whoever had sent this had given me time to think, to back out if I wanted. But what would I back out of? There was no address, no map, just follow the lanterns. I didn't think I'd do it, but when 11:45 rolled around, I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. If it was a trick, I could laugh it off. If it was something else, something stranger, I wasn't about to miss it. I didn't have to search long. When I stepped onto the sidewalk, I saw the first lantern. It was small, a glass globe strung with metalwork vines, glowing faintly blue like bottled starlight. It hung from a tree branch, low enough to catch the eye but too delicate to belong to anything modern. As I approached, the glow brightened, like it could see me. My heart quickened, but I pressed on. The second lantern appeared halfway down the block, fixed to an old lamppost, its light a deep amber this time, pulsing gently as though it was breathing. The third was at the corner, suspended above a bench that looked like no one had sat on it in decades. One after another, the lanterns led me, their glow shifting in color. Blue to amber, amber to green, green to silver, until I realized I was leaving the familiar streets of my neighborhood entirely. The city seemed different here, quieter, as though I had slipped into an older version of it, where buildings were closer together and streets curved in ways they hadn't before. The lanterns guided me down an alley that narrowed until I had to turn sideways to pass through. When I emerged on the other side, I froze. There, in front of me, was a door. It was set into the brick wall of a building that didn't appear to have windows or even a name. The door itself was impossibly tall and arched at the top, made of dark, weathered wood and covered in carvings, symbols, constellations, shapes I couldn't recognize. In its center was a brass handle shaped like an outstretched hand, palm up, waiting, and just above the handle, hanging in the air without string or hook, was the final lantern. This one glowed silver, casting dancing shadows against the brick. I hesitated, the weight of the silence pressing against my shoulders. Whoever had sent the note had wanted me here, at this exact moment. But what would happen if I turned the handle? What waited on the other side? Before I could talk myself out of it, I reached out and placed my hand over the brass one. The carvings on the door seemed to shiver at my touch, and then, click, the door swung inward. Beyond the door was not a room, not in the way you'd expect. It was a place, an open expanse that stretched out infinitely under a sky that didn't seem like it belonged to Earth. Stars hung so low, I felt like I could reach up and touch them, their light reflecting on a surface that wasn't quite water but shimmered like it. Floating above it all, tethered to invisible threads, were hundreds, no, thousands, of lanterns. Some were small, like the ones I'd followed, but others were massive, spinning lazily in the air like planets in orbit. Each glowed in its own hue: ruby red, stormy gray, pale gold. The air smelled faintly of something metallic, like the promise of rain. "You're early," a voice said, startling me. I turned to find a figure sitting cross-legged on what appeared to be a floating platform of dark wood. He looked about my age, wearing a coat stitched with stars. Actual stars, their light flickering as he moved. His hair was dark and wind-ruffled, his face calm, like he had been waiting for me for a very long time. "Early?" I asked, finding my voice. "You said midnight." "It's midnight somewhere," he said, standing up and stepping off the platform. The surface beneath him rippled, but he didn't sink. "Come on, you'll want to see this." Before I could think, I followed him, stepping out onto the not-quite water. To my surprise, I didn't fall through. It held me, firm and glassy, rippling gently with each step. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He glanced back at me, one eyebrow raised. "A crossroads," he said simply. "The lanterns show the way." "To where?" "To everywhere," he replied. "Every path, every possibility, every choice you haven't made yet. Each lantern holds a door." He stopped walking and gestured toward a massive green lantern, its glow swirling like a storm. As I watched, an arched doorway appeared in the air beneath it. Through the doorway, I saw a forest, the trees unnaturally tall, their bark glowing faintly as if lit from within. "That one," he said, "leads to a place where it's always twilight, and the trees sing when the wind blows." He pointed to a smaller lantern nearby, this one a deep purple. Another door appeared beneath it, showing a street made entirely of glass, where people moved like silhouettes across the shimmering surface. "And that one," he said, "is a city that doesn't sleep. Not because it's busy, because it's alive." I stared at him, overwhelmed. How do you choose?" He smiled faintly. "You don't. The right lantern chooses you." As if in answer, a soft, golden glow appeared at the edge of my vision. I turned to see a lantern drifting toward me, its light warm and steady, like sunlight through closed eyelids. A doorway formed beneath it, shimmering into existence. I couldn't see what was beyond it, only light. I looked back at him, uncertain. "What happens if I go through?" He tilted his head. "You'll see." The lantern hovered closer, the light brushing against my skin like a whisper. My heart pounded, but not in fear. Something else. Anticipation. I reached for the doorway, and as my fingers touched its edge, the world around me seemed to shift. The stars blurred, the lanterns dimmed, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Then, I stepped through, and the story began. To be clear, this wasn't an ordinary vending machine. It was one of those slightly menacing ones you find in office buildings, where half the buttons don't work and the other half are sticky with soda residue. It sat in the break room of my office, humming quietly, as if it were alive and plotting something. I'd passed it 100 times before without a second thought. But that day was different. That day, the vending machine decided to fight back. I was having one of those afternoons, where your email inbox feels like a personal vendetta and your brain is so fried you can barely remember your own name. All I wanted was a candy bar, just a small, sugary bribe to get me through the last couple of hours before I could leave. I fished some coins out of my bag and approached the machine. It greeted me with its usual chaotic selection, snacks in weirdly mismatched rows, like someone had stocked it in a hurry and didn't care about the consequences. I punched in the code for a chocolate bar, B4, the only snack worth risking my dignity for. The machine made its usual clunking noises, gears grinding as the metal coil holding my candy bar slowly began to turn. And then it stopped. My candy bar hung there, suspended by a cruel twist of metal, just out of reach. "No," I said softly, like I was trying to reason with it. "Don't do this to me." I jiggled the machine. Nothing. I pressed the coin return button. Still nothing. The candy bar dangled mockingly, swaying slightly, as if laughing at me. "Fine," I muttered. We're doing this. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then gave the vending machine a firm nudge. It rattled slightly, but refused to surrender my snack. My frustration mounted. I nudged it harder. Still nothing. At this point, it was personal. I'd already invested $1.25 and a significant chunk of my dignity, and I wasn't leaving empty-handed. What followed was an escalating battle between me and the vending machine that would probably get me banned from break rooms forever. I shook it. I kicked it, lightly at first, then with increasing passion. I crouched down and tried to shove my arm into the snack slot, but my wrist got stuck, and I had to awkwardly wiggle free. The machine stood there, smug and immovable, like a bouncer at an exclusive candy club. And then, I saw it. A sticker, barely clinging to the side of the machine, faded and peeling at the edges. It read, "For assistance, press hashtag." I stared at it, incredulous. Who was I supposed to be calling? The vending machine hotline? Some magical snack technician who would swoop in and save me? I didn't believe for a second that it would work, but I was desperate. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number. After 2 rings, a voice answered. "Vendocorp customer service," a man said, in the kind of monotone that suggested he'd been dead inside for years. "How can I help you?" I hesitated. Hi. Your vending machine ate my money, and my candy bar is stuck." There was a long pause. "Did you try shaking it?" "Yes," I said through gritted teeth. "Kicking it?" "Obviously." The man sighed. "All right. Give me the machine's serial number." I squinted at the machine and read out a string of faded numbers. There was a faint clacking of keys on the other end of the line, and then the man said, "Interesting. That machine's not in our system." "What do you mean, not in your system?" "It's not registered. It shouldn't even be there." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So what do I do?" There was another long pause. Then, in a voice that was no longer bored but oddly serious, he said, "Step away from the machine." "What?" "Step away from the machine." Against my better judgment, I backed up slowly, phone still pressed to my ear. As I did, the vending machine let out a low hum. Not its usual mechanical whirring, but something deeper, louder, like a growl. Is this normal?" I whispered. "No," the man said flatly, "but it's not unheard of. Sometimes they malfunction." "Malfunction?" "Technically, we call it an awakening," he said. "But don't worry. Just stay calm. And whatever you do, don't." The line went dead. At that moment, the vending machine gave a violent jolt. I yelped and jumped back as its lights flickered, and the metal coils began to spin wildly. Snacks tumbled to the bottom in a chaotic avalanche. Chips, candy bars, gum, trail mix, until the entire machine was empty. Then, with one final groan, the vending machine fell silent. I stood there, stunned, surrounded by snacks, as the break room door creaked open. My coworker Lisa poked her head in, eyes widening at the sight of me standing in a sea of junk food. "What happened?" she asked. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How do you tell someone you just survived a vending machine exorcism? Instead, I bent down, grabbed my chocolate bar from the pile, and said, "Don't use this machine, ever." Lisa nodded slowly and backed out of the room. To this day, I don't know what really happened. The vending machine was gone by the next morning, replaced by a newer, shinier model that looked suspiciously innocent. No one ever mentioned it, and I wasn't about to bring it up. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that voice on the phone, about the phrase, "not unheard of," and I wonder, how many other vending machines out there are just waiting for their moment to awaken? So, now I have to ask, what's the weirdest thing that's ever fought back against you when you least expected it? Or am I the only one out here waging war against snack machines? The first time I met Jude, he was building a doorway in the middle of an empty field. There were no walls, no house, not even a foundation. Just a door frame standing on its own like a skeleton of something forgotten. I was walking my dog, and she was the one who spotted him first, barking at the figure hunched over a plank of wood. Jude straightened at the noise and turned to face me, hammer in one hand and a crooked smile spreading across his face like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "Afternoon," he said, nodding casually, like this was completely normal behavior. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked, yanking the leash gently as my dog tugged toward him. "Building a doorway," he replied as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Yes, I can see that," I said. "But why?" Jude wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, leaving a smudge of dust behind. He was dressed in jeans covered in paint splatters and a shirt that might have been white once upon a time. His eyes were sharp, blue-gray like storm clouds, and they crinkled slightly at the edges when he smiled. "Because sometimes you need a door to nowhere before you can find a way out of somewhere." I blinked at him. "I'm sorry, what?" He grinned, clearly enjoying my confusion. "You wouldn't understand unless you've been stuck." "Stuck where?" "Anywhere," he replied, waving his hammer vaguely at the sky, the grass, the horizon. "Take your pick." My dog barked again, as if urging me to leave the strange man alone, and honestly, she was probably right. But something about Jude, about the absurdity of what he was doing, about the way he said it like he meant it, made me linger. "Well," I said finally, "it looks good for a door to nowhere." "It's not done yet," he replied. "You'll have to come back to see it when it's finished." I didn't say I would. I just tugged my dog gently and walked away, feeling like I'd stepped out of reality for a moment and into some bizarre fairy tale where men built doors and fields for no reason at all. But the next day, I went back. I told myself I was just curious. I wanted to see if he'd actually finish it, or if it was all some strange performance art piece he'd abandoned halfway through. When I arrived, Jude was there, sitting cross-legged on the ground with a small tin of green paint next to him. The door frame was upright now, sturdy and taller than I'd realized. He was painting the wood carefully, a shade of green so deep it almost looked black. "You're back," he said without looking up. "I was in the area," I replied, lying badly. "Of course you were," he said, dipping his brush back into the paint. I stood there for a moment, watching as he worked. The paint went on smoothly, and the door frame, still freestanding in the middle of nowhere, was beginning to look less absurd and more deliberate, like it belonged there. "Why green?" I asked eventually. "Green's the color of doors that lead somewhere," he replied. "I thought you said this was a door to nowhere." He paused, turning to look at me with that half-smile again. "Well, nowhere can still be somewhere if you go far enough." It was the kind of nonsense that usually would have made me roll my eyes, but coming from Jude, it sounded almost profound. "Do you always build things like this?" I asked, sitting down on the grass a few feet away. "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly when I feel like the world's missing something." "And you think the world's missing doors?" "Not doors," he said. "Opportunities. Ways out. People forget how important they are until they can't find one. Is that what happened to you?" For the first time, Jude hesitated, his brush hovering above the wood. "Maybe." I wanted to ask him what he meant, what he was running from, what he was looking for, but I didn't. He didn't seem like the kind of person who gave away his secrets easily. Instead, I kept coming back. Over the next week, I'd find excuses to walk by the field. Jude was always there, hammering nails, sanding edges, painting in deliberate strokes. The doorway took shape in small, careful increments until it was complete. A perfect door standing on its own, gleaming green in the sunlight. It had hinges that didn't connect to anything, a doorknob that turned but opened to nothing but air. It was ridiculous, and it was beautiful. "What now?" I asked one afternoon, when the door was finally finished. Jude leaned against the frame, wiping his hands on a rag. "Now we see if it works." "It works?" He shrugged. "You never know." "Jude," I said, trying not to sound exasperated, "it's a door in a field. It doesn't lead anywhere." "Doesn't it?" he replied, and before I could argue, he turned the knob and stepped through. I froze. He didn't disappear or anything dramatic like that. He walked through one side and out the other, emerging with a triumphant grin. "See? Works perfectly." I laughed despite myself. "I don't get it." "You're not supposed to," he said. "Not yet." The next morning, he was gone. The door was still there, but Jude had vanished, leaving behind no tools, no paint cans, Nothing but the freestanding doorway in the middle of the empty field. I waited for days, stopping by every afternoon, expecting to see him again. I never did. At first, I thought about tearing it down. The door was absurd without him. People would pass by and laugh, call it pointless, call it vandalism. But every time I reached for the knob, I stopped. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, I stood in front of the door and remembered what Jude had said. Nowhere can still be somewhere if you go far enough. I placed my hand on the doorknob and turned it. I stepped through. Nothing happened. The world didn't change. I didn't find myself in another place, another life. But as I stood on the other side of the door, I realized something had shifted, something inside me. The doorway was still absurd, still useless in every practical sense, but it felt like a question now. A question I didn't have the answer to, but that I wanted to keep asking. I still visit the door sometimes. It's weathered now, the paint chipping, the wood splintering in places. People stop to look at it now and then, take photos, leave notes tucked into the cracks. I like to think Jude would be happy about that the world found something in his door after all. And sometimes, when I stand there at dusk with my hand on the knob, I can almost hear him, his voice drifting on the wind. You never know where a door might take you until you open it. Have you ever felt like something ordinary was quietly asking you to believe in something bigger? This morning, the sun blinked. Not in the poetic, oh the clouds moved kind of way. I mean the actual sun. Giant, blazing, life-giving ball of fire. Flickered, dimmed for just a split second, and then blinked back to full brightness. I know, because I was staring straight at it. Terrible idea, by the way. I don't recommend. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe I wasn't fully awake yet. Hadn't had my coffee, hadn't even yelled at my cat for knocking my phone off the nightstand. But then, I heard it. A voice. A quiet, irritated mutter. Ugh, overslept again. I froze. Who said that? Juniper, my cat, sat smugly by the window. Oh, you're gonna love this. What? I turned to her, the dread rising in my chest. You can talk? Focus, she said, flicking her tail toward the window. We've got bigger problems. Reluctantly, I turned back to the sun. It had grown brighter, angrier, almost, and I could hear the voice again, more clearly this time. All right, I'm up, the sun grumbled. Its voice enormous, crackling like embers. You don't have to glare at me. Oh wait, that's my job. I stumbled back, clutching the windowsill like it might steady the entirety of reality. Is the sun talking? It's been known to complain, Juniper said, yawning. He's cranky. Comes with the territory of burning all the time. This isn't normal. I shouted, half expecting Juniper to tell me it was all a prank. It is if you pay attention, she replied lazily. The universe gets tired too, you know? I ignored her and turned back to the window, my brain on fire. What does the sun have to be cranky about? Oh, let's see, said the sun, suddenly sounding a lot closer. Being on 24/7. No breaks. No holidays. Just up and shining because everyone expects it. I'm a giant, blazing sphere of plasma, and I get treated like a lamp post. The clouds began shifting around it nervously, drifting away like they were avoiding an angry coworker. Birds spiraled in awkward loops, chirping anxiously as though they weren't sure where to go. You're the sun, I stammered. This is your job. I didn't sign up for this, the sun shot back. You think I wanted to float in space for billions of years, lighting up your little dirt rock? No, I got shoved into this role, and nobody even asks how I feel. I'm just supposed to burn. You sound like my toaster, I muttered. Your toaster gets it, the sun replied. That's why I like appliances better than people. Toasters, heaters, light bulbs, we're all doing the same thing. We shine, we burn, and no one thanks us. Juniper snorted behind me. Told you he's dramatic. The sun flared, its voice suddenly booming with intensity. I heard that, Juniper. She flattened her ears and swished her tail. Yeah, keep glowing. Excuse me, I interrupted, waving my arms wildly at the sky. What am I supposed to do about this? I'm just some person in pajamas. The sun groaned, a sound like a furnace roaring to life. You're not supposed to do anything. I'm just venting. Do you know how boring it is being me? No conversation, no hobbies, just endless shining. I don't even get to move around much. Earth just keeps circling me like some obsessed ex. Obsessed ex? I choked. You do, the sun said accusingly. Year after year, you orbit, and I'm just here, stuck. Buddy, I said, pressing my fingers to my temples. I think you need therapy. I need a nap, the sun rumbled. At that moment, something even stranger happened. The light dimmed again. The sky shifted, turning a deep, bruised gray like the entire atmosphere had taken a breath and was holding it. Shadows stretched, bending unnaturally along the streets. Are you turning off? I asked, panicked. Just for a second, the sun grumbled. No one will notice. Just need a moment. You can't turn off. I shouted, pointing dramatically at the window. You're the sun. You keep plants alive. You stop us from freezing to death. 1 second, it repeated, quieter this time. The light continued to fade. Juniper, do something? I shouted at the cat, who was now licking her paw as though the sun wasn't having an existential crisis. What do you expect me to do? I'm a cat. The darkness deepened. I watched as streetlights blinked on one by one, confused and flickering. Birds spiraled aimlessly, landing on telephone wires and staring up at the sky in collective judgment. Okay, fine. I yelled at the sun, desperate now. You're appreciated. You're the MVP. You're a cosmic miracle. Please just stay on. The sun paused. Its glow, now faint like a dying ember, brightened slightly. Go on. You're invaluable. Nothing works without you. You're the center of our entire solar system. Keep going, it said smugly. You're warm and life-giving and, so bright. I stammered. You're like nature's oven, and you're way better than any of the other stars. None of them even matter compared to you. The sun hummed, a low, satisfied sound. The light around me began to strengthen again, shadows retreating, colors snapping back to their usual vibrancy. That's more like it, it said, sounding immensely pleased. See? That wasn't so hard. You almost turned off the entire planet because you needed a compliment? I gasped. I'm allowed to have needs, the sun replied. I shine all day, every day. The least you could do is show a little gratitude. Juniper hopped onto the windowsill and stared out at the now fully glowing sun. You're so needy. I heard that. The rest of the day was disturbingly normal, considering I'd had a conversation with a star. The sun kept shining. The birds went back to their normal spirals, and Juniper pretended like none of it had happened. But as the day ended, I stood outside and watched the sunset, the orange glow spilling across the horizon. For the first time, it didn't just look like a sunset. It looked like the sun curling up for the night, stretching its rays one last time before clocking out. Good job today, I said quietly, feeling ridiculous. The sunlight dimmed just a little slower, lingering a second longer than usual. You're welcome, the sun murmured, low and warm. As the stars began flickering to life in the deepening dark, I stared up at them suspiciously. You guys better not start talking too. Juniper, sprawled beside me on the grass, let out a lazy purr. Oh, they will. Just give it time. And I swear I saw one star twinkle just a little too smugly in response.